My name is Ren. Before the monsters came, I was a chef, a real one, with a real kitchen and a name people said out loud. Now the world ranks a man by how many monsters he can kill, and a man who cooks for a living is a punchline. The apocalypse didn't just end the world, it ended the idea that feeding people mattered. 10 years since the first dungeon broke open. Now there are safe zones, and everywhere else is a hunting ground. Hunters fight, ranked F to S, and eat whatever the guild hands them. Gray ration blocks that keep you alive and taste like nothing. Because who would waste a real meal on a world this close to the end? My family's restaurant closed a year after the fall, and I've been a ghost in the city ever since. A man with bird hands and no rank, selling boiled scraps from a stall nobody visits. The numbers over my head said it plain. Reputation, 0. Patrons, 1. And that one was just me. Every mouth in this city eats from the guild's hand. They control every ration, every ingredient, every ounce of meat that comes through the gate. And the food they hand out is exactly good enough to keep a body alive, and not a calorie better. That wasn't stinginess, that was policy. Because a man who's hungry is a man who'll work for crumbs, and a man who's full asks questions. The guild didn't survive the apocalypse by feeding people well. It survived by keeping everyone just desperate enough to never look up. A city of hollow stomachs never asks where the food went. I watched them hand gray blocks to people with hollow eyes, and I thought the same thing I'd fought for a decade. Someone should cook something real. But nobody pays for real in a city this close to the end. That's the line I'd been telling myself. It was wrong. The surge came at dusk, the way it always does. No warning but sirens and the sound of claws on the wall. Everyone with a rank ran to the line. Everyone without one ran to hide. I was halfway to a shelter when I remembered my stall still held my father's knife, and the part of me that hadn't died yet went back for it. I didn't fight. I'm no hunter. But when a thing with too many teeth broke through the cordon and came at a corner where a family was pinned, I grabbed my father's knife and ran at it. Not to win, just to buy them 3 seconds. It was the dumbest thing I'd done in a decade. It was also the first time in a decade I'd mattered. It swatted me into a wall like I was nothing. And lying there, bleeding into the concrete, I heard something that wasn't the sirens. A chime, clean and bright, and words forming inside my skull. Something that had been sleeping in me a very long time was waking up. An interface, like the hunters describe, but different. It didn't show my strength or my rank. It showed dishes, ingredients, gold, reputation, patrons. I stared at it, half dead, and I laughed, because even the system that saved my life thought I was still a cook. And then I read the part that didn't fit. A recipe, an effect, and a rule printed underneath it. The system would count and unlock, but never conjure. It would show me the how and make me do the work. It would never just hand me the meal. That was the deal, and I was in no position to bargain. The counters it showed me were all zeros. No dishes, no ingredients, no gold, no reputation, and a single patron who was just me, bleeding into the rubble. A blank ledger for a dead man. But it was mine, and it was the first thing that had been mine in 10 years. The recipe was almost insultingly simple. Boiled storm hare with wild onion, plus 5 strength, permanent. Not a 5% boost for an hour like every alchemist's potion in the city. Permanent. I read it again because my burned hands were shaking. So I did what a chef does. I foraged. Wild onion in the cracks, a storm hare from a snare I'd set months ago and forgotten, water I boiled 3 times so the contamination wouldn't kill me before the meal did. It took a full day and both my burned hands, and when it was done, it was just a bowl of stew, but it was real food. The system confirmed it before I'd even lifted the spoon. Dish complete, ingredients spent. 2 things in the world had been traded for 1 bowl, and the ledger said it was worth it. I didn't believe the ledger, not yet, but I was about to. I ate it, and the system confirmed what I already felt. Strength I hadn't earned, settling into my bones like it had always been there. No fade, no come down, the way every potion in the city crashes after an hour. Just power, paid for and kept. The number ticked up and stayed. And then came the question the system didn't answer. If 1 bull did this to me, a man who'd never thrown a punch that mattered, What would it do to someone who is actually strong? What would it do to a whole city that's been eating gray blocks for 10 years? I sat there in the quiet with an empty bowl and a head full of arithmetic. One dish had just made a weak man stronger for good. There were thousands of people beyond my door, all of them hungry, all of them sold short by the guild. The math of it was terrifying. That's where I found her. Ember. F rank. The rank they hand out to people who'll never rise. The ones they call cannon fodder. They were throwing her out of the safe zone for the crime of taking up space and not being useful enough to earn it. She wasn't crying. She was just standing there, too thin, eyes too wide, holding a bag that was clearly empty, and she looked like she'd already accepted it. A clerk read her the rules. No rank, no ration, no spot, like they were a kindness. And I thought about the one bowl I had left and the 10 years I'd spent being useless. Maybe this is what it was for. Maybe every bad thing that led me here was just the long way around to this girl, standing in the dust with an empty bag and nobody to feed her. I fed her the last of the stew. She ate it like she'd forgotten what food was, and when she was done, the system did something I'd never seen it do. It counted her, not as a customer, but as a patron. The number ticked from 1 to 2, and a word appeared that scared me. Loyalty. She looked up from the empty bowl and asked me the only question that mattered. Why? Nobody gives away real food, she said. Not in this city. Not to an F rank. I opened my mouth and found I didn't have an answer yet. I wasn't sure I'd ever have one. I just knew that for the first time since the fall, the thing everyone called worthless had saved someone, and a girl the city threw away was looking at me like I'd given her something worth more than any rank. A reason to still be here. That look undid 10 years of being a punchline. The problem with doing something impossible is that it gets noticed. The food guild runs this city's belly, and a rumor was moving faster than any surge. A dead chef's stall in the lower ward was serving food that made you stronger for good. Word like that doesn't fade, it climbs. It reached the guild hall by nightfall. An enforcer stood before Doran and laid it out flat. A cook in the lower ward, handing out permanent buffs. Doran didn't raise his voice. Men who run monopolies never do. He just gave the order, calm as a butcher pricing meat. Find the stall, the recipe, and every fool who'd eaten from it. I'd just committed the only real crime in the apocalypse, not cooking, making something the guild couldn't tax, couldn't control, and couldn't let live. A man who feeds the city for free is a man who owns the city, and the guild has never let anyone own this city but itself. They came at dawn, before the first pot was even hot. A guild enforcer, big as a wall, with a badge and a blade at his hip, standing in my doorway like he'd already decided how this ended. And behind me, with nothing but a broom, stood a starving F-rank girl who'd decided differently. He delivered his message flat, like he was reading it off a door. Guildmaster Doran sent his regards, and he wanted the stall, the recipe, and the girl handed over. The way he said it, there was only one ending he'd bothered to rehearse, and it ended with me on the ground. The apocalypse spent 10 years teaching me that cooking was worthless. It took one night to teach me something truer. The moment you make something real, the world comes to take it. I tightened my grip on my father's knife, smiled for the first time in a year, and told him to come in. I just put the water on. I woke to the sound of something heavy being lifted. Ember was up before the sun, and she was moving the broken iron stove I hadn't been able to shift in a year. One thin arm, no strain, like it weighed nothing. Last night she could barely hold her own empty bag. The buff was real, and it was already inside her. She set the stove down and stared at her hands like they belonged to somebody else. She said she felt wrong, too strong. I told her it wasn't wrong, it was permanent. 10 years of gray blocks had left her starving, and one bowl of real food had started paying her back. She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen on her, and asked if it was forever. Forever, I told her. Then I opened the pantry to see if anything had survived the night, and the smile on my own face died before it finished forming. 2 things. That was all that was left. 2 ingredients. That was everything. A storm hare from the snare I'd checked at dawn, and a handful of wild onion already turning soft at the edges. The system counted what I had and wouldn't let me pretend otherwise. No conjuring, no magic fridge. Whatever I cooked had to come out of the world, and the world was nearly empty. I worked anyway. Boiled the hare down for stock, sweated the onion and scavenged fat, stretched one carcass as far as the pot would carry it. Every cut was measured because there was nothing behind it. A chef with a full pantry can afford to waste. A chef with 2 ingredients cooks like a man betting his last coin. The guild wanted it this way. Every ingredient in the city flowing through their gate, priced so a dead man's stall could never stock a shelf. 2 ingredients wasn't an accident. It was the whole design, and I'd just spent a year too proud to see it. The smell did what my reputation never could. A hunter, real gear, a sword scored from 100 kills, badges down his coat, stopped dead and followed his nose to my counter. Hunters eat gray blocks like everyone else, but they remember what food used to taste like, and they'll pay to remember it again. I hadn't set a price. I'd never sold a single bowl. I looked at the pot, thought about the 1 wilting onion left on the shelf, and named a number low enough he'd say yes, but high enough to buy 2 more ingredients. He dropped the coins and didn't haggle. He just ate, standing up, eyes closed. And when the system flickered and counted him, not a patron, not yet, just a man with coins, I understood what I was holding. I wasn't selling food. I was selling something the guild couldn't make, and the first buyer had walked past every ration stall in the city to get it. Word moved faster than the surge had. By noon there was a line, not the hollow-eyed line at the ration stall, but people with questions, people who'd heard the hunter bragging that a dead chef stew had put steel in his arms. I cooked everything I could buy and watched the line grow longer than my pot could feed. I spent most of the hunter's coin the same hour, back to the guild's market where they priced a single hare like it was gold, because they could. I cooked the 3rd dish the system had ever shown me and sold every bowl. By sundown, the shelf was down to 1 ingredient again, and my jar held 15 coins. The hunter came back and brought 2 friends, and the system counted him this time. A patron, a man who'd eat nowhere else. Reputation climbs exactly as fast as it paints a target on your back. 5 people knew my name by nightfall. I should have known that was 5 too many. He came after dark, when it was just me and Ember and a day's coins in a cracked jar. Big, drunk, too comfortable, the kind who's shaken down every weak stall on the block and never met a cook who could hit back. Hand it over, chef, and I won't break your hands. I grabbed his wrist before I thought about it, and he didn't move it. The buff I'd eaten, the same +5 strength I'd dismissed as a parlor trick, was real enough that a street thug's arm froze in my grip. Ember hit him behind the knee with the iron stove lid, and he folded like wet paper. That's when I understood the "so what" of strength. The buff didn't just make us harder to rob, it made us worth robbing. A cook with no strength gets shaken down once and forgotten. A cook who can break a wrist gets a reputation, and reputation brings bigger men than this one. After he ran, Ember didn't stop moving. She swept, she scrubbed, she restacked the crates, and every few seconds she'd look at her own hands and laugh. The girl the city called cannon fodder had just helped run off a grown man, and it had lit something behind her eyes. So I put her to work. I taught her to watch the fire, to never waste a drop of water, to know the moment before a pot boils over. She learned faster than anyone I'd ever trained because she wasn't learning for coin. She was learning because, for the first time, somebody had told her she was useful and meant it. That was the night she stopped being a customer I'd fed and became the first hand in my kitchen. Loyalty isn't bought with one bowl, no matter how good it is. It's built a day at a time, one small act of trust after another, and she just laid the first wall of it. What I didn't see that night was the man in the doorway across the street. He'd been there since the line formed, a guild enforcer, gray cloak, badge half hidden, writing everything down. How many customers, how much coin, who ate? The guild doesn't let a stall sell real food without knowing exactly what it's selling. He saw the thug run. He saw Ember's arm. He saw a dead chef's kitchen doing numbers no ration stall had done in 10 years, and he wrote it all in a ledger that would walk back to the guild hall before midnight. The apocalypse has one rule, and I'd finally broken it. Don't make anything the guild can't tax. I should have been afraid. Instead, a cold thing settled in my chest that felt a lot like being awake. Let them watch. I'd spent 10 years invisible, And look where it got me, shaking down a thug over a cracked jar, waiting for the next man to come and try. The report hit Doran's desk the same way every threat hits that desk, quietly and by a man paid not to be seen. A cook in the lower ward, the enforcer said, serving permanent buffs, not an hour's boost, permanent. His customers are getting stronger, and it isn't wearing off. Doran read the numbers twice. Not angry. That's the thing about men who run monopolies. They don't rage at threats, they price them. He ran a finger down the ledger and asked the only question that mattered to a man who owns the food. What does the cook need to keep cooking? It was a cold thing to watch. Even from a distance, I didn't know I was being seen from. Doran didn't see a cook in that ledger. He saw a loose variable in an equation he'd spent a decade balancing. And men like that don't strike. They let the numbers do the killing, slow and certain. I knew, the way you know a storm's coming, that the guild had me on a list now. The smart move was to close the stall, bury the recipe, and go back to being nobody. It's what a decade of being worthless had taught me to do. Hide and survive, and never ask for more. But Ember was asleep in the corner with a blanket she'd earned, and a hunter had walked past every guild stall in the city to eat my food. And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't want to be invisible. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to build something too big for them to take with one enforcer at dawn. So I didn't close the stall. I sharpened my father's knife, put the last ingredient where I could see it, and started planning a menu for a city that had forgotten what food could do. I'd feed them all, and the guild could get out of the way or learn what happens when a hungry city stops being hungry. They came at dawn again, but this time it wasn't an enforcer with a blade. It was a clerk with a sheaf of papers and a seal, the kind of man who collects debts with ink instead of iron. He didn't threaten me. He didn't have to. He just laid the paper on my counter and smiled. 15 coins in my jar, and the demand on the paper was for more than I'd ever held. The guild didn't send muscle this time. They sent arithmetic. A tax on every bowl, a license on the door, a fee for the right to keep doing the one thing I was finally good at. Starve me out or bleed me dry. The noose was the same. I looked at the paper, then at Ember standing behind me with her broom, and I laughed, because the guild had just told me the truth they'd been hiding for 10 years. They weren't afraid I'd cook. They were afraid of what I'd build, and I was only just getting started. The rumor came to me over a bowl of stew. A hunter, chewing slow, told me about a woman in the gutters, an S-rank, a legend, the kind of name the city used to say like a prayer. Now she slept under a bridge and sold her sword arm's memory for scraps. Washed up, he said. Lost her right arm to a dungeon boss. Now she's nothing. The apocalypse has a way of doing that. You can be the strongest thing alive, and one bad minute in a dungeon makes you garbage the next morning. The city doesn't keep what it can't use. It spits out the broken ones and never looks back. I knew that feeling better than most. He asked why I cared about a cripple, and I didn't answer because I wasn't sure yet. But something about it stuck in me like a splinter. Maybe it was the thought that 10 years ago, the world threw away a cook the same way. Maybe I just wanted to see what worthless looked like on someone who used to be great. I found her where they said, under the overpass, back to a wall, a sword longer than my arm laid across her knees where she couldn't wield it. Silver white hair, scarred leather, one sleeve pinned flat where her right arm used to be. Her eyes were amber and cold, and they didn't soften when they found me. She watched me like I was another scavenger come to pick her bones, and there was no self-pity in her. That's what surprised me. A woman the world had thrown away, and she sat there like a queen who'd simply chosen a bad chair. Pity would have been an insult, and she knew it, so I didn't offer any. I held up the bowl I'd brought and said the only true thing I had, that I was a cook, and I made food that did things to the body, permanent things. Her eyes changed then, just a flicker, but I caught it. The first real thing that had crossed her face all day. That night, the system showed me something new. I'd barely thought the question, can food grow back what a dungeon took? And there it was, a recipe I hadn't asked for, like the system had been waiting for me to want it. Titan marrow stew, regenerates a lost limb or stat, permanent. I read it twice, then 3 times. Not a 5% boost for an hour, not a temporary crutch for a broken body. Regeneration. an arm grown back forever. In a world that ranks a person by what they can kill, this wasn't food. It was a resurrection, simmering in a pot. And then I read what it would cost, and the cold settled in my chest. The dish could do the impossible, which meant the ingredient would be worth more than my life, and every greedy hand in the city would reach for it the moment I tried to get one. Titan marrow. The name said it. It comes from Titan-class monsters, the things S-rank parties hunt in the deep dungeons, and half of them don't come back from. It isn't forged in the cracks or snared in a ditch. It's carved out of a corpse the size of a building, and every ounce flows through the guild's gate. And it never reaches a common counter, because the guild knows exactly what that marrow can do in the right hands. The parties that kill a titan sell to the guild, and the guild resells to nobles at a markup that would make a merchant weep. Food and a leash, all in one bone. It's the most guarded thing in the safe zone. The guild prices it to ruin anyone who wants it, because a man with a regenerated S-rank on his side is a man who stops being afraid of them. I had 15 coins, one ingredient, and a stall they already wanted to close. Buying marrow through their counter wasn't a purchase. It was a declaration of war with a receipt. So I didn't go through their counter. I went around it. A man who trades in the dark, the kind the guild pretends doesn't exist. The marrow he had was smuggled, untaxed, and the price was everything I owned. 14 of my 15 coins, my good knife, and a favor I'd owe him, which in this city is a debt with teeth. I knew the risk. Rare ingredients rot fast, and this one had already spent 2 days out of the ice. The spoilage clock was running before I'd even paid. I handed over the coins, the knife, the promise, and walked out with a parcel worth more than my stall, my reputation, and my life put together. Broke again. 1 coin to my name, a favor hanging over me, and a rare ingredient going soft by the hour. But I had what I'd risked everything for, and somewhere under an overpass, a broken S-rank was waiting to see if a worthless chef could actually keep his promise. I cooked through the night. First a tester, a spoonful of the marrow in plain broth, tasted and verified, because a precise chef doesn't bet a fortune on an ingredient he hasn't tested. The system counted it, then let me proceed. Then the real work, the stew, slow and exact, the marrow reduced at a heat that would ruin it if I blinked. Every step was a coin dropped into a fire. Too hot and the marrow's potency dies. Too long and it spoils mid-pot. I watched it like a man watches a fuse, ember feeding the stove and never asking why I was burning a week's money on a woman we barely knew. There was no second chance. 1 parcel, 1 pot, 1 shot. Dawn came up gray, and the stew came up perfect, the smell of it filling the stall like a promise. I ladled it into a bowl, and the system confirmed what I already felt in my burned hands. If this worked, everything changed. If it didn't, I'd just thrown away the only real thing I'd ever built. I set the bowl in front of her and told her what it was, and that it would cost her nothing, because I'd already paid. She stared into the steam for a long moment, and I saw the war on her face. A woman like her doesn't take a stranger's food. She spent too long learning that every handout is a trap. Then she ate, and the world held its breath. The stump of her right arm, the sealed, useless thing the dungeon had left her, began to burn, and she gritted her teeth and didn't cry out, and beneath the scarred leather I watched something begin to move that hadn't moved in a long time. The restore had started. She looked up at me, amber eyes wide for the first time, and whispered the only thing that mattered. "It's real." I just nodded, because my throat was too tight to speak, and somewhere behind us I heard Ember start to cry, quiet and hard, like she'd been holding it in for years. The problem with a miracle is that it doesn't happen quietly. A gutter full of the city's forgotten had watched a crippled S-rank take a bowl from a dead chef, and now they were watching her arm begin to grow back. Word like that doesn't crawl, it runs, and it runs straight to the people who threw her away. By the time I'd helped her to her feet, the crowd had doubled, and I saw the fear in the eyes of the ones who'd mocked her loudest. Because a washed-up S-rank is safe to laugh at, a restored S-rank is something else entirely, a debt about to be collected, in every corner of the city that had turned its back on her. That was the so what. I'd made her whole, and now every old enemy she'd ever made knew she was back. Restore a blade, and the world comes running to make sure it stays broken. I'd bought her an arm, and I just bought us an army of grudges along with it. She stood in my stall that night, the regrowth bandaged and burning under the cloth, and she looked at me the way you look at the only person who ever paid a debt you didn't know you had. "Why?" she asked. "I'm nothing to you. I was nothing to anyone." I told her the truth, that 10 years ago the world threw away a cook, and I'd spent every day since learning that worthless is just what the world calls people it's afraid to let get strong again. I didn't buy an arm, I told her. I'm hiring the strongest person in this city, if she'd have the job. And just like that, the system counted her. A fourth patron, an S rank, the sharpest thing in the safe zone, sworn to a stall nobody would have looked at twice a week ago. I'd gambled everything on a broken blade. Now I had one, and the city was about to find out what that meant. They came for her that same night. Not the guild this time, a scout in dark leather, the kind who works for the people who make problems disappear. He'd heard the rumor, same as everyone, and he'd come to see for himself whether the broken blade was really sharpening again. Sable stepped in front of me before I could move. One arm, still bandaged, her left hand already on the sword she'd carried so long without being able to use. The scout took one look and went pale. The whole city had written her off. Now the bill was coming due, and he'd just watched a ghost learn to hold a sword again. He ran, and standing there in the dark, with a regrowing S rank at my back and the first of many old enemies scattering into the night, I understood what I'd really bought with my last coin. Not just a blade, a war, and I'd just chosen a side. The stall died on a Tuesday. I'd spent my last coin on a miracle for Sable, and now the shelves were bare and the pot was cold, and the line that used to snake down the block had stopped coming. A cook with no ingredients is just a man standing in an empty room. The system counted my stock the way it always did, honestly. That's the guild's real weapon, and I finally saw it clear. They don't need to burn my stall. They just need to own every route the food travels, so that when I run out, I stay out. Gold means nothing if there's nothing to buy. A reputation means nothing if you can't serve the next bowl. I had 4 patrons, an S rank with a regrowing arm, and 1 coin in my jar, and not a single onion to put in the pot. Somewhere in this city, food was moving every hour, crates and carts and coins I couldn't see. I just didn't know how to reach it. Not yet. I found her in a market the guild doesn't bother to police. A woman selling the last scraps of a fortune, a coat too fine for the dirt under her feet, a ledger open in one hand like a shield. Dark hair and a practical bun, green eyes that added me up the moment I stepped close. A banker and a refugee at once. The story came out in pieces. Clove, the merchant heiress who'd run the city's ingredient trade until her family framed her for a theft she didn't commit, stripped her name, and threw her into the gutter with the rest of us. Now she sold what she could carry and kept the ledger that proved every route, every price, every lie. A woman with nothing but a book of numbers, and I was a man with nothing but an empty kitchen. I looked at that ledger, and for the first time in a week, I saw a door. She'd been ruined by the same machine that was starving me. That made her either my best ally or my worst mistake, and I had no way to know which. She opened the book, and the whole city's belly spilled out. Where ingredients come from, foragers, river smugglers, dungeon parties, what the guild pays and what it charges, which suppliers are loyal, which are bought, and which route the patrols skip after the 3rd bell. 10 years of trade in a hand so neat it was almost a weapon. I'd spent my life thinking food was just what I cooked. Clove showed me the machine behind it, and that the guild wasn't a monopoly so much as a leak, a knot of men skimming a city's hunger for profit. She knew where every coin went, which meant she knew where the food could go instead. That's when I understood what I was looking at. Not a disgraced heiress, but a living map of everything I needed, every road, every price, every hand between the wild and my pot. She'd said it herself. I didn't have an ingredient problem. I had a routing problem, and she knew every route in the city that wasn't theirs. She named her terms like she was pricing a shipment. She'd supply the stall, ingredients, routes, the suppliers who'd still talk to her, for 2 things. Protection, because a woman with the guild's ledgers in her head is a loose end, and a cut of the profit, since she'd been robbed once and never meant to be broke again. It wasn't charity, It was the first honest deal I'd been offered since the fall, a trade where both of us brought what the other couldn't get. She had the roots, I had the reason people would pay. Sable watched from the corner, hand on her sword, and didn't object. That was as good as a signed contract. She almost smiled. Then she spat in her palm and held it out, the way merchants do when they mean it, and I shook it without hesitating. The guild had built its empire on owning the food. We just decided to steal it back, one crate at a time, through every hole in their wall. I fed her before we did anything else, because that's the rule of my table, and because I wanted to see what the system made of a woman who just traded me a city. She ate the way merchants do, slow and assessing, and then her eyes went wide in a way she couldn't hide. And the system flickered and counted her, not a customer, not a supplier, a patron, the fifth, a disgraced heiress who just thrown in with a dead chef and a broken blade. The system doesn't care about your past. It counts who eats from your table and chooses to stay. She'd just chosen. I looked at the four of them, Ember, Sable, a hunter, and now Clove, and I saw the shape of the thing I was building. It wasn't a stall anymore. It was a crew, the first one I'd ever had, and every one of us had been thrown away by this city before we found each other. The first run happened after the third bell, when the patrols changed shifts and the alley behind the tanners went blind. Clove moved through the dark like the streets were a second ledger, every turn memorized. Sable walked point, hand on her sword. An unwatched route is still a route through a city full of teeth. We met her suppliers in a cellar under a closed granary, foragers who sold out the back, rivermen smuggling since before the fall, cash for crates, no writ, no stamp. Every ingredient had a source and a hand behind it, wild herbs, marsh salt, meat cured in a cold room 2 streets over. It took half the night and left me flat broke again, but it proved the whole point. The guild owns the gates, not the city. It owns the writs and the granaries and the counters, but it doesn't own the dark or the men who move through it. Not if you know where to walk, and I'd just found someone who did. By dawn, the back room was a stock room. 30 ingredients on the shelf, a number the system displayed like a dare. The moment the stock landed, it unlocked what variety makes possible. 3 new dishes, each a buff I couldn't make on an empty shelf. Not magic, just the difference between a full pantry and a dead one. Then the line came back, and it came back bigger. I cooked all day and into the night. Ember on the fire, Sable on the door, Clove on the coins. Real food, real buffs, real profit. The jar that had held 1 coin was a strong box by sundown, and the system ran the total with an indifference that scared me a little. 200 gold, more than I'd seen in 10 years of scraping by, and I knew exactly what it meant, because Clove said it out loud while she counted, her voice flat. Money like this has a smell, she said, and it carries. The guild's books were already starting to notice the numbers stop matching. Clove was right. The guild keeps its own books, and books notice when the numbers stop matching. A clerk ran his finger down a column, stock leaving their suppliers, but the coin not coming back through their gate, and the frown on his face was the first crack in a machine that had run unopposed for a decade. That's the so what of every crate we'd carried. Supply lines don't stay hidden forever, not when they're feeding the fastest growing stall in the lower ward. The guild didn't know it was us yet, but they knew something was bleeding them, and men who run monopolies don't tolerate a leak for long. I looked at Clove. She looked at the door. Enjoy the gold while it's warm, she said. They'll be coming to collect it back soon enough. And I believed her, because I'd spent a decade watching how this city treats anything that grows faster than the guild allows. That night, for the first time, we sat together and looked at what we'd built. A chef, a broken blade, a cannon fodder hunter, a disgraced heiress. 4 people the city threw away, around a table that a month ago couldn't fill 1 bowl. The system counted 4 patrons, and we looked at each other like the start of something. Clove opened her ledger and planned the next runs. Bigger, faster, deeper into routes the guild thought it owned. Sable mapped the exits. Ember practiced with a real blade, her buffed arms steady, and I sharpened my father's knife, realizing I wasn't a lone cook anymore. I was feeding an operation. Nobody argued when I said what we were. We feed this city, we protect each other, and we make the guild watch us do both. That was the moment the stall stopped being mine and started being ours. It was also the moment the guild should have started being afraid. The report reached Doran next morning, and this time he didn't read it twice. A stall he'd meant to strangle was still cooking. Worse, on his own supply, siphoned through routes the guild had written off as dead. Someone who knew his ledgers was feeding his enemy. That made him put down his tea. He didn't rage. He gave one quiet order to the man at his shoulder, and the order was a noose. No more warnings, no more license fees. Cut the flow, starve the routes, lean on every supplier who ever sold out the back of one of my granaries until they remember whose city this is. I looked at my full shelves and heard the clock start. The gold was warm, the stock was high, and it was all about to run out because the guild had finally stopped taxing me and started starving me. Doran was done playing, and I was about to learn whether a worthless chef could feed a city with the whole city set against him. The embargo didn't come with a sword. It came with silence. One by one, Clove's suppliers stopped answering. The forager found a guild writ on his door. The riverman's boat was seized. The granary cellar boarded shut with a guild seal on the nails. Every route she'd spent years mapping closed in a single night. That's Doran's genius, and it took me too long to see it. He didn't have to touch my stall. He just had to make every hand that might feed it too afraid to move. No arrests, no writs in writing, just fear delivered door to door. A monopoly isn't a wall you break down. It's a silence you can't argue with. The shelves were still full from the last run, but I'd spent 10 years learning that full shelves are just a clock, and it was already ticking. The question wasn't whether we'd run out. It was what we'd do when we did, and whether the four of us would still be standing when the last bowl was served. It took 9 days. The line kept coming because hunger doesn't read guild writs, and I cooked down my stock the way a ship burns its own mast to keep moving. 30 ingredients, then 20, then 12. Clove stood at the door each morning with a ledger that only ever said the same thing: nothing coming in. 8 ingredients left, and the system counted them and wouldn't round up. Meat in the cold room was starting to turn because the blockade had cut our ice too, and ice is a supply line. An ingredient spoiled is worse than one never bought. You watch it die in your own pantry. Every hour a coin burned. That was the moment the so what landed. The guild didn't need to beat me, or even to come for me. They needed me to watch my own kitchen die slowly, bowl by bowl, shelf by shelf, until there was nothing left to serve but gray blocks and surrender. It was working, and I could feel it. I called the four of us together and said what nobody wanted to hear. The roots are dead, the suppliers are scared, and the guild owns every gate in the safe zone. But outside the wall, in the wild where the monsters are, nobody owns anything. That's where the food is. We'd have to go get it ourselves. The room went quiet, in that way a room does when the truth lands too heavy to argue with. Clove's pen stopped mid-number. Ember stared at me like I'd just suggested walking into the sun. But nobody said no, because the shelves were almost empty, and a man with nothing left to cook is out of options. Sable said nothing, but she was already checking her sword, one arm bandaged, regrown only part way, still the deadliest thing in the room. I'd spent my last gold on real weapons, boots, and a field pack to keep meat cold past the gate. If the guild wouldn't let food reach my kitchen, I'd go meet it where it lived. The wild is not the city. The moment we passed the gate, every sound was a question, and every shadow had teeth. Ember ranged ahead, reading tracks like a girl who'd survived a lifetime on the edge of being expelled. Sable walked point, sword out, one arm enough to make anything in the trees think twice. I carried the pack and the knife and the fear, because out there I was the weakest thing in 100 meters, and I knew it. We found sign quickly, a dire boar's wallow, a trail of broken saplings, the kind of monster a full hunting party would take with bows and bait and a plan. We had none of that. We had Sable. It came out of the brush faster than I could track, a wall of muscle and tusk. Sable stepped in and met it with one perfect cut, her blade finding the joint the armor doesn't cover. 3 strikes to drop it, 3, and I stood there with my knife, finally understanding what an S rank means. Back inside the wall, the real work began. A dead monster is a mountain of meat, and meat is a clock. Spoiled in the warm, ruined by a wrong cut. I worked through the night the way my father taught me, breaking the boar down by lamplight. Ember held the light. Clove logged every cut. And the system, watching, did what it does. The moment the first cut was clean and the first pan hot, it unlocked what a monster's body could become. 2 new dishes, each one a buff carved out of a beast that had wanted me dead an hour ago. Not conjured, earned, with labor and a blade and a night of sweat. I stared at the numbers and understood the trade the wild offered. The guild owned the tame food, the ration blocks and the writs. But the dangerous food, the food that made hunters strong, was out there for anyone brave enough to go and bleeding enough to bring it back. We just walked through that door. The morning after the hunt, we ate what we'd killed, and the crew sat quiet with the cost written on them. Ember had a gash on her arm. Sable's regrown shoulder ached. I had blisters on both hands and a back that wouldn't straighten. Self-sufficiency, I learned, is just another word for nobody's coming to save you. But the math held. 1 hunt, 2 buffs, a cold room restocked with meat the guild never saw and couldn't tax. Dangerous work and sustainable, the only kind of supply Doran couldn't cut, because it didn't flow through any gate he owned. The wild was our granary now. Clove marked it in the ledger with a small, satisfied scratch of her pen. The first clean line she'd written in 9 days. For the first time, she said, "We don't need his city. We only need to keep coming back alive." It was the most dangerous sentence I'd ever heard her speak, because it was true. When the starvation failed, the guild switched tactics. They didn't send muscle to the stall. They sent a man with a smile and a purse, and they aimed him at the people who ate from my table. I caught him at the door, mid-sentence, trying to buy my patrons back with promises of cheaper rations and guild coin. The hunter looked at the purse, then at the bowl in his hand, then at me, and he laughed. "I've eaten gray blocks for 10 years, he said. Your blocks keep me alive. His food makes me strong. Come back when the guild can offer that." The recruiter's smile didn't survive the sentence. That was the day I learned the guild's last weapon had gone blunt. Money can buy a lot in this city, but loyalty isn't a price point. You can't outbid a man who remembers being fed when he was starving. Not with a purse, not with cheaper blocks. The recruiter left with his coin and nothing else. Ember changed fastest of all. The girl thrown out of the safe zone for being useless had eaten my food every day for weeks, and the buffs were stacking the way I'd feared they might, and hoped they would. She wasn't cannon fodder anymore. She was fast and strong and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. On the next hunt, she didn't just scout. A monster broke past Sable's guard and came at me, and Ember was there before I could scream, planted her feet and drove a real blade through it, her 2 thin arms steady as iron. The thing fell at my feet, and she looked up at me, wide-eyed and shaking and grinning. The system's numbers had stopped being numbers weeks ago. Now they were a girl with freckles and a blade, standing over a dead monster, finally believing she was worth something. Doran had thrown her away. I'd fed her, and now she was a weapon he'd never get back. I stood in my kitchen that night and let the quiet settle. The guild had cut my roots, threatened my suppliers, tried to buy my people, and here I was, still cooking, with meat in the cold room that never touched their gate. They'd thrown everything at starving me out, and it hadn't worked. I wanted them to know it. I ran my thumb along the edge of my father's knife and thought about the boy who'd let this city convince him cooking was worthless. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who'd walked into the wild and come back with dinner. The guild could choke the gates all they liked. I'd found the thing they couldn't cut, the world outside. But I also knew the truth Clove had written in her ledger without being asked. We were surviving, not winning. We could hunt a boar. We couldn't hunt forever. If we were going to break the guild for good, we needed something it couldn't just shrug off, and that meant going deeper, to the places even S-rank parties feared. The rumor found me the way the important ones do, over a bowl, from a hunter glancing over his shoulder like the walls had ears. A dungeon, he said, a rift outside the far wall, opened quiet and stayed quiet, and deep inside, past the traps and the things that guard them, something was growing the guild never touched. I felt the shift in the room before anyone said a word. A rare ingredient, guild-free, sitting in a dungeon nobody had claimed yet. The kind of thing that could unlock a dish the guild couldn't match and couldn't tax. The kind of thing a man trying to feed a city against a monopoly would risk everything to reach. Sable met my eyes across the counter, and I saw the old fire in her. The dungeon took her arm, and she'd been waiting to prove she was whole again. I didn't have to ask. The guild had spent weeks starving me out. Now I'd walk into the one place its writs didn't reach and bring back the thing that would end its empire. The rift was nothing like the stories. No gate, no guards, no guild writ nailed to a post. Just a crack in the ground the size of a street, breathing cold air, with a light coming out of it that didn't belong to the sun. Dungeons don't announce themselves. They just open and wait and swallow whoever's fool enough to climb down. I stood at the edge with Sable and Ember and felt every one of my weaknesses at once. I was a cook, no rank, no combat skill, hands made for a knife and a pan, not for the things that live down there. The last time a dungeon opened, the world ended. The last time Sable went in, she came out short an arm. I'd spent 10 years running from monsters. Now I was about to walk into their house, on purpose, because somewhere at the bottom was an ingredient worth more than the whole guild, and I was the only one who'd know it when I saw it. Ember said it first, and Sable agreed, and for once, the two of them were on the same side. You stay here, Chef. You're the weakest one of us. If something goes wrong down there, you die first. It wasn't cruelty. It was arithmetic, and it was correct. But it was also wrong, and I made them both hear why. Clove pressed a wrapped ration into my hand at the edge, her green eyes too bright, and told me to come back so she wouldn't have to run the stall alone. Sable finally nodded, the way a commander does when the only good call is the one she hates. Stay behind me, she said, and if I say run, you run. Then we climbed down into the dark, and I left every safe thing I'd ever known at the top of the rope. The dungeon has its own geography, and it hates visitors. The floor sloped wrong, the air tasted of metal, and every few steps the walls narrowed like a throat trying to swallow. Ember ranged ahead, reading the stone for tripwires and pressure plates, her buffed senses catching what I'd have walked straight into. Sable kept her blade between us and the dark. They came out of the walls, not monsters first, but traps, a jet of something that ate through rock, a floor that dropped into nothing, the kind of things built to thin out a party before the real teeth ever show. We moved slow and careful, and I stopped feeling like the weakest one and started feeling like the one who'd get the others killed if I took a single wrong step. Then the first real thing came at us, and Sable cut it down before I finished screaming. Her arm, the one my stew grew back, held the sword like it had never been gone. The dungeon took that arm once. It was about to learn what it had made. I saw it before either of them did, because I was looking with a chef's eye, not a hunter's. In a crevice high on the far wall, a fungus was growing, a cluster of pale stalks with caps that glowed like banked embers, the exact color the rumor had described. Ember and Sable would have walked past it. They saw a glow. I saw an ingredient. I knew what it was the moment the system flickered to life, the rare thing, the prize, the ingredient that could unlock a dish the guild couldn't match. But I also knew the first rule of foraging in a dungeon: nothing rare grows unguarded. The prettiest mushroom in the apocalypse is always the bait. The ground shook before I could finish the thought. The glow wasn't a prize, it was a lure, and we'd just walked into the middle of the thing it was meant to feed. It came out of the dark like the dark itself had stood up, bigger than the dire boar, armored in stone, with the ember glow fungus growing straight out of its back. It didn't guard the prize, it was the garden the prize grew in, and we were 3 people and a bag of torches standing in the middle of its den. Sable hit it first, and her blade turned off the stone hide with a shriek of sparks. Ember threw herself between it and me, knife out, too small and too brave. The thing batted Sable into the wall like the monsters used to bat me, and for one horrible second I saw her arm, my arm, the one I'd grown back, dangling at a wrong angle. She couldn't hold it, not alone, not pinned, not with one arm against a dungeon boss. The fight was over, and everyone knew it but me. I looked at the thing, at Sable bleeding, at Ember shaking, and I reached for my pack instead of my knife. I did the only thing I know how to do. I cooked. The heart of the monster we'd killed on the descent, kept cold in my pack. I had it searing over a pocket flame in under a minute, my hand steady because steady was the only thing that would keep Sable alive. The system counted the seconds with me. Every cut, every turn of the pan, every grain of salt. The boss roared and charged, and Ember threw herself at its legs, screaming, buying me seconds with her own body. I didn't look. I couldn't. A chef's hands don't shake when the dish is the only thing standing between his people and a monster's teeth. The meat hit the right color, and the system flared. I slid the pan across the stone to Sable. She didn't ask what it was. She ate it off the floor, with a broken sword arm and a dungeon boss bearing down, and the strength hit her like a second heartbeat. The change wasn't loud. It was quiet, the way the worst things always are. Sable's hand closed around her sword, and the arm I'd grown back set itself with a sound like a promise, and she stood up out of the rubble with 15 new points of strength burning in her blood. The boss hesitated. It knew. Everything in that cavern knew. She went through it the way a blade goes through water. Not fast, not desperate. Exact. Every cut landing where the stone hide had a seam. Every step a lifetime of combat knowledge spent on a creature that had never met an S rank with a full belly and a reason. Ember dragged me back, and we watched the strongest thing I'd ever fed become the strongest thing in the room. And that was the so what, landing like the boss's body hit the floor. My cooking had just won a dungeon fight. Not as a trick, not as a potion, but as the difference between a broken blade and a blade that doesn't break. The guild was going to find out that a chef on the field is worth more than 100 ration blocks. We won, but a dungeon doesn't let you rest. I went to work on the corpse while the body was still warm, harvesting the fungus with the care it deserved, cutting it so the glow didn't die with the host. The boss's body was a larder too, organ meat, marrow, hide for nothing, but meat and bone for the cold room back home. Waste nothing, my father said, especially not the thing that tried to kill you. The system counted it all as we loaded the packs, monster parts, the rare fungus, enough to restock the stall and then some. 15 ingredients by the time the bags were full. I stood over the dead boss and watched the glow of the fungus in my hands, and I understood what we'd just taken. This wasn't dinner. This was a key. A key the guild didn't have, to a door they'd been trying to keep locked since the fall. And in a week, I was going to walk it straight through that door. We came out of the ground at dawn, 3 people who'd climbed down and come back. Ember had a wound that would scar and a grin that wouldn't leave. Sable walked straighter than she had in a year, the arm whole and the fire back in her. And I had a bag full of a glowing fungus and a truth I'd never be able to unknow. Ove was waiting at the top, pale from a night of not sleeping, and she didn't say anything when we surfaced, just grabbed my pack and started logging what we'd brought back, because that's how Clove handles fear, by counting. The ledger filled line by line, and I watched her eyes get wider with every item. Word spread before we even reached the wall. A dead chef and his crew had walked into an unclaimed dungeon and walked back out, with a rare ingredient and a story about cooking a boss to death. Reputation, I was learning, is just survival with witnesses. The offer came the same night. A man in clothes too clean for the lower ward, with the calm of someone who's never gone hungry, set a letter on my counter and didn't bother introducing himself. His kind always assumes you already know. The auction houses heard about your dungeon run, he said, about the fungus, about the permanent buffs. A fortune for one dish. The same dish the guild had spent weeks trying to starve me out of making. I looked at the letter, then at the glowing fungus in its cold box, then at Sable and Ember and Clove standing behind me, the crew that had crawled into a dungeon for me and crawled back out. I didn't know it yet, but I'd just stepped from the wild into the deep water. A fortune attracts more than buyers. It attracts every predator in the safe zone, and the guild most of all. I'd survived the dungeon. Now I had to survive being worth something. After the dungeon, the rumor stopped being a rumor. A cook in the lower ward served food that made a man stronger, permanently, and in a city that ranks everyone by how hard they can kill, that was worth more than any monster part. The offer came the way serious offers always do, not loud, but with coin behind it. A faction broker, clean silk in a city of dust, wanted to auction one of my dishes to the highest bidder. He offered 40 gold just to stage it. I had 5 patrons, a pile of scavenged monster parts, and 40 gold to my name, enough to feed us a week, not enough to mean anything. I didn't say yes for the money. I said yes, because every faction in the safe zone would be watching that auction, and watching is the first step to needing. Clove saw the ledger before I did. Famous, she said, is the one thing the guild can't tax. She left the rest unsaid, but I heard it anyway. Famous is also the one thing that gets you killed. The dish had to be unforgettable, so I reached for the rarest thing we dragged out of the dungeon, a gland from the worm that nearly killed us. It would spoil in 2 days, and it was the only one we had. Cook it now, and there is no second try. A chef's whole life is a bet that the flame and the clock will forgive him. I worked all night, trimming, searing, reducing, my burned hands moving by feel the way they always have. Sable kept the fire one-armed and silent. Ember ran the water and watched the door. Clove tallied every coin it cost us in fuel, salt, and the one ingredient we couldn't replace. The kitchen never stops being an accounting. When it was done, the system didn't cheer. It just counted. A dish of worm gland and marrow, plus 20 agility, permanent, stacking. 1 plate, no seconds, no refunds, no do-over. I wrapped it and carried it to the auction like it was a bomb, because in this city, that's exactly what it was. Bidding opened at 200, and I watched it climb the way you watch a fire. Every faction wanted the edge. Every hunter wanted to be the one who ate it. 400, 800, 2,000, and the room stopped pretending it was about food at all. A fat-bellied faction head slammed a fist and threw 500 over the last bid, and his rivals answered. Money in the apocalypse isn't for spending, it's for surviving, and these men were hurling it at a single plate. I stood in the back in my stained apron and understood, finally, what the guild had always known. Hunger is leverage. It ended at 5,000 gold, more than I'd earned in 10 years of being worthless. The winner paid in a chest so heavy it took 2 men to lift, and for 1 stupid second I let myself feel safe, like the numbers on my interface were armor instead of a target painted on my back. We walked the chest bag through the ward and set it on the stall's only table. Ember didn't touch it. She watched the street. Sable kept her hand on a hilt she still couldn't fully draw. Only Clove opened the lid and began counting, because someone had to, and counting is how she keeps the world from tipping over. 5,000 gold. I could feel every eye in the ward swing toward my stall like a compass needle. My interface ticked over, and Clove said the thing I should have said to myself. Gold doesn't protect you. It just makes you worth robbing. She was right, and I knew it. But for one night, I let the team eat real food and told myself we'd earned a single breath. That was the mistake. Not spending the gold yet, but believing for even a second that rich meant safe. By midnight, the whole lower ward knew a broke cook had come into 5,000 gold. And knowing is the only invitation a thief needs. They came in 1s and 2s, silhouettes at the shuttered windows, testing the lock the way you'd press a bruise. Fame and gold don't buy you quiet. They buy you a crowd with knives. The guild was there too, not breaking in, just watching. An enforcer posted across the street like a debt collector, and somewhere behind him, Doran, learning exactly how much my cooking was worth now. I'd spent the night telling myself the money made us stronger. The truth was, it had just made us pray. Clove didn't sleep. She sat with the ledger and the door bar, and every few minutes she'd glance up and name a face or a number. Who'd been seen, what was moving. I asked her how she knew. She said, I used to be rich, Ren. I know exactly what comes for it. They hit us 2 nights later, 3 men with blades and a plan, in the alley where the lock was weakest. I heard the door splinter and reach for my father's knife, and for 1 cold second, I thought, this is what 40 gold could have prevented. Then Sable moved. 1 arm, and it was enough. She put the first man through a crate before he finished his swing. Cold, precise, every one of her S-rank instincts awake again. Ember came in low behind her, fast as a spark, and broke the second man's grip with the strength my food had stacked into her bones. The third ran. They always run, in the end. When it was over, I stood in the splintered doorway with a knife I'd never needed to raise, and I understood what the system had been trying to teach me since the surge. My cooking didn't make me strong. It made the people around me strong, and I'd been hoarding the wrong currency. I sat on the floor among the broken wood and did the math I'd been too rich to do the night before. The gold hadn't saved us. 2 women who ate my food had. which meant every coin in that chest was worthless unless I turned it into the only things that actually keep people alive, tools and the people to use them. Clove was already ahead of me, as always. "You can't eat gold," she said, and laid out her ledger. Equipment, security, ingredients, rent, so the guild can't yank the stall out from under us. That's the whole point of money in a starving city. You spend it before someone takes it, or you bury it and wait to be robbed. So I stopped thinking of myself as a man who got lucky and started thinking like a kitchen that had to survive the winter. The auction wasn't the prize, it was seed. And a seed you don't plant is just something the birds eat. I spent a slice of it that same morning, the way you spend money once you've finally seen the target on your back. A real stove to replace the cracked iron, knives that would hold an edge, a reinforced door and bars on the windows, because the next crew would come better than the last. Then the part that cost the most and mattered most, Sable and Ember, armed and fed, and a handful of the ward's hungry hired to watch the walls and haul the water. Every coin went into something that could cook, fight, or stand guard. Gold into tools, tools into safety, safety into time, and time is what a chef who wants to live needs most. Clove watched the gold move and didn't flinch. She'd been the one to say spend it. But she made me hold the bulk of the chest back, liquid and ready. "The guild war is coming," she said, quiet, "and you don't break a monopoly with a full pantry and an empty purse." The new patrons came with the news of the auction, the way water follows a crack. 3 more mouths that first week. Not customers this time, but people who wanted to be near the food, who'd heard a cook was giving away strength and decided to stand close enough to catch some. I fed them all and asked for nothing, and the system counted each one like a promise kept. 8 patrons now. It wasn't an army. It wasn't even a kitchen brigade, but it was the start of a wall around us made of people who'd eaten real food and remembered what it tasted like. Clove put their names in the ledger, one by one, and next to each name a skill. A seamstress, a night watchman, a boy who could climb. "Fame brought us knives," she said. "Let it bring us hands, too." And for the first time since the fall, I let myself think the stall could become something that outlasted me. The problem with becoming famous is that the men who already run the world notice you for real. Across the city, in a polished room that smelled of nothing, Guildmaster Doran turned a small vial over in his fingers and read the report twice. A dead chef's stall was auctioning permanent buffs for 5,000 gold a plate. He didn't raise his voice. Doran never raised his voice. He just told his enforcer what any man does when he can't buy the competition and can't tax it. You poison it at the root. A shipment of ingredients, doctored at the gate, sent through the very chainas I just paid to secure. I didn't know it yet. I was in my stall, counting patrons and thinking about tomorrow's menu, feeling, for the first time in a decade, like the world might finally leave me alone. The guild had other plans, and the poison was already on its way. It started at noon, in the middle of the lunch rush, when the quiet regular by the wall went gray and folded off his stool into the dust. The bowl clattered, and for a second the whole line just stared, because in a city that's been hungry for 10 years, a man falling over his food means one of 2 things, and both of them are poison. I caught him before he hit the ground. He was burning up, and his eyes had gone wrong, and the foam in his mouth smelled faintly sweet, the kind of sweet that doesn't belong anywhere near a kitchen. Ember started screaming for a healer. Sable cleared the stall, and I did the only thing a chef can do when a plate goes wrong. I tasted it. One drop on my tongue, and I knew. This wasn't bad cooking. This was murder, and it had come through my own door, in my own ingredients, aimed at everyone who trusted me enough to eat from my hand. Word spreads faster than any poison. By sundown, the street was full of people who'd eaten here and people who just wanted to watch a man burn for it. "The chef killed him," someone yelled, and the crowd took it up, because it's easier to blame a face than a system. My patrons, my 8, stood at the edge, and I watched doubt flicker across every one of them. They'd trusted me with their hunger, and hunger is the one thing you don't gamble. A sick man on the ground, a queue that had eaten from the same pot, and a guild that would love nothing more than to have the story finish with my stall torn down and my name in the gutter. The poison wasn't just in the food, it was in the air now. Ember stepped in front of me, hands up, and shouted them down. "Ren didn't do this. All that unbreakable loyalty aimed at a mob that didn't care. But loyalty doesn't prove a man innocent. Only the truth does. And I had a way to find it, if my tongue hadn't gone numb from the poison I just tasted.
I closed the stall and did what no hunter and no guild could do.
I went back through every ingredient with my tongue. A chef's palate is a weapon the apocalypse forgot existed. 10 years of burned hands and bitter ration blocks had sharpened mine until I could read a plate the way Sable reads a battlefield.
Meat was clean, the herbs were clean,
But the salt we'd bought 3 days ago through the new supply line, carried a ghost, a bitterness buried under the brine so fine you'd never catch it unless you'd spent your whole life tasting. Belladonna, reduced, not enough to kill fast, enough to make a man sick and make a stall look guilty.
I spat, rinsed, and tasted again to be sure. There it was. The guild hadn't poisoned my customers. They'd poisoned my ingredients and let me do the serving. I'd been made into the weapon and the scapegoat at the same time, which meant the man who sent it never expected me to taste it back. Clove found it in the ledger before I finished rinsing my mouth.
The salt had come through a new runner, a man none of us had used before, who'd offered a price just barely too good to refuse. She followed the marks back to the gate, and every thread led to the same place, a guild-approved shipment, doctored at the checkpoint, sent to the one stall in the city that was making Doran lose sleep.
They let it through, she said, flat.
The gate is guild-run. Nothing poisoned passes that gate without a stamp and a palm greased. She'd been waiting for a move like this since the day she joined me. She'd seen Doran poison rivals before, the way you'd salt a field so nothing grows.
But knowing who poisoned it and proving it are two different wars.
I had a tongue and a sick man and a warehouse of suspicion. What I needed was a way to show the whole ward, not just say it, that my food was clean and the guild's hand was in the salt. So I went back to the kitchen. I had a plan, and it started with a pot of boiling water. That night, I built a wall nobody could see. Every ingredient tasted before it touched a pan. Every finished dish verified by the system before it left the counter. It was slow. A chef already racing spoilage can't afford to taste twice, but it was the price of keeping anyone alive long enough to eat.
The system helped in its way. It never conjured and it never lied. It simply confirmed that a dish was real and clean, or it refused to count it. One poisoned plate had to be thrown out, and the waste stung. Food thrown away while people starved outside. But a dead patron would have stung worse, so I tasted, verified, and only then served. Ember watched me work and asked, quiet, why I kept eating my own poison. I told her the truth, because if I won't risk my own tongue, I can't ask anyone else to risk theirs. That's the whole job of a chef, and I'd forgotten it while I was busy getting rich. I went public at the square, the way you'd open a wound and let it drain. I set the poisoned salt on a crate in front of half the ward, and I named the runner, and the route, and the gate, and the stamp. I didn't accuse a shadow. I held up the evidence and let the city taste the same trace I'd found. The sick man's family was there, and I paid for his healer out of the chest, in front of everyone. Gold I'd been too proud to spend on the right things, spent now on the only thing that mattered, making it plain that, whatever else I wasn't the one who'd poisoned my own neighbors. And then the part that flipped it, a guild runner in the crowd got recognized, and the mob, the same mob that had wanted to burn my stall an hour ago, turned and chased him through the streets. I'd purified my supply. The exposure did the rest, and it wasn't aimed at me anymore. Across the city, Doran got the news the way a general learns his ambush was ambushed. The crowd had turned on his runners. The ward was chanting my name. A cook who should have been ruined in a day was standing on a crate with the guild's own poison in his hand, and nobody was listening to the official story anymore. He didn't smash anything. That's the thing about Doran. He doesn't rage. He recalibrates. Poison had failed because I'd tasted it, so the next move would be bigger and colder. But for one night, the failure cost him. His own ward stopped trusting the gray blocks, and trust, once it leaves a monopoly, is nearly impossible to buy back. I'd survived the sabotage by doing the one thing the guild never expected from a man they'd written off as worthless. I'd been careful, and careful in a city that runs on shortcuts and gray blocks is a kind of magic all its own. The patrons came back,
and they brought company. The 8 who'd wavered returned first, ashamed and hungry, and I fed them without a word about it. A man who's been starved for 10 years deserves a bowl more than he deserves a lecture. Then the 4 new ones, drawn by the story of the cook who caught the poison with his tongue.
12 now. Clove wrote every name down, and, beside the names, what each could do. The system counted them the same as ever, not as customers, but as people who'd chosen to stand with the food. I looked at the number and understood that the poison hadn't killed the stall. It had cured the one weakness I'd been ignoring. I'd been rich and famous and soft. Now I was tested, and the ward knew it. The crisis hadn't made me weaker. It had forced me to build the quality control that would carry me through everything that came next, and everything was coming. Doran sat alone in his cold room and made the decision poison couldn't finish. If he couldn't discredit me from the outside, he'd starve me from the inside, or bury me under something worse than a rumor. He reached for a different lever, the one every monopolist keeps for the day the customers stop being afraid. He'd turn the city against itself, raise the ration price, cut the gray blocks, let the ward go hungry and blame it on the upstart cook who disrupted the supply. And if hunger didn't finish the job, there were other hands he could hire, hands that didn't ask questions and didn't leave a guild stamp on the work. I felt the shift, the way a chef feels a change in air pressure. The poisoning was over, but the war had just moved to a higher heat. And outside the wall, something else was changing too. Something even Doran hadn't ordered, stirring in the dark beyond the gate. The scream came from the wall at 2 a.m, and it wasn't a thief's scream. A watchman had seen something in the dark beyond the gate, something that moved wrong, that was bigger than it should be, that answered the old monster's calls in a voice nobody on the wall had ever heard. By dawn, the hunters were whispering it. The monsters had changed, stronger, faster, a breed that shrugged off the same blows that had killed their kin for 10 years. The apocalypse hadn't been sleeping, it had been evolving, and every blade that used to be enough was suddenly not enough anymore. I stood at my stall with the morning's first pot on the fire and heard the wall's bells start, and I understood something cold and certain. The poison had been a fight over food. What was coming next wasn't a fight over anything. It was a fight to survive, and the only edge left in the city was the one I cooked with. They came at dawn, and the wall's bells rang in a key I'd never heard before. Not alarm, but something close to fear. The first evolved monster hit the gate line and didn't stop. It took a spear to the chest and kept coming, and the hunters who'd held that wall for 10 years suddenly looked like children swinging sticks. I watched from the stall as the C ranks fell back and the B ranks tried, and even the best of them landed blows that should have killed, blows that would have killed a week ago. The thing shed them like rain, stronger, faster, a breed the city had no answer for, because 10 years of gray blocks had built an army too weak to adapt. They turned it back, barely, at a cost I'd be counting all day, but everyone on that wall had seen the same truth written in blood. The old rules were over. The monsters had leveled up, and the city hadn't, because the city had been eating nothing but ration blocks and expecting to survive on them. They brought the dead and the maimed through the gate all morning, and the ward stood in a quiet line to watch, because in a city this small, every body has a name. I saw a hunter I'd fed once, a man who'd bought my first buff, carried past with his leg at the wrong angle, and I saw the others staring at him, doing the math I'd already done. That's when it clicked for everyone at once. The hunters who'd eaten my food, the ones with permanent buffs stacked in their bones, had taken the same blows and walked away. The ones who'd stuck to the guild's gray blocks had folded. The difference wasn't rank. It wasn't courage. It was a bowl of real food and the edge it left behind forever. A rumor becomes a fact the moment people start dying for it. By noon, the whole safe zone understood. The worthless chef's cooking wasn't a curiosity or a luxury anymore. It was the only thing between this city and the thing outside the wall, and everybody wanted a seat at my table now. The line that morning didn't end. Hunters, civilians, a mother holding a child who'd never tasted anything but gray blocks, all of them pressing coins at me, begging for a dish, any dish, that would stack a little more strength into their bones before the next bell rang. I'd dreamed of a crowd like this for 10 years. I'd never dreamed it would look so afraid. Clove tried to organize it, But demand is a flood, not a line. "Everyone," she said, eyes wide over the ledger, "everyone in this city wants your food now." She was right, and it should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a weight, because I could cook for 20, maybe 30, and the city had thousands. The guild could have fed them. The guild has storehouses full of gray blocks. But I knew Doran wouldn't lift a finger. A scared, hungry city is a city that pays any price. So it fell to me and my one cracked stove to feed a wall full of people who'd finally realized what I'd been trying to tell them since the surge. Food is the weapon. I cooked until my hands wouldn't close. 2 pots where I'd had 1. Every burner lit, every surface covered in butcher's work. Sable hauled water and guarded the door. Ember prepped monster parts until her fingers bled. Clove rationed the ingredients like a general rationing powder, because every bowl now had to count double. The labor was brutal, and the system only ever counted what was real. A dish half ruined by haste didn't count, didn't buff, got thrown out. So I slowed down. You can't rush a permanent stat into a bowl, and the people at the door were betting their lives on me not trying. That's the quiet horror of being needed. There's no room left for a bad batch. But the fire held, and the dishes stacked, and one by one, the faces at the door left with strength settling into their bones. I watched the interface tick up and didn't let myself stop because the wall was still ringing, and the next evolved wave wouldn't wait for my hands to rest. The second wave hit at dusk, and this time, the hunters who'd eaten from my stall didn't fall. I saw it from the gate. A C-rank who'd been cannon fodder his whole life, plant his feet and stop a claw that would have opened him up yesterday. The buffs I'd cooked into him were the only reason he was still standing. My stall wasn't a business anymore. It was a lifeline, and everybody knew it. The ward left offerings at my door. A scavenged knife, a jar of pickled root, a child's toy. Not payment, but tribute. The way you'd bring something to a shrine when the world outside is ending, and the shrine is the only thing holding. I stood in the doorway with a ladle in my hand and watched my food keep people alive. And for the first time since the fall, I let myself believe the thing I'd buried for a decade. Feeding people matters, not as a trade, as a power, maybe the only power that ever mattered. And then the guild made its move, the way it always does, not with a sword, but with a price tag. The day the city most needed food, Doran doubled the cost of a gray block and halved the ration. A starving city charged more for less, while the storehouses sat full behind his walls. The outrage was instant and useless, because a monopoly doesn't need your approval, only your hunger. People cursed the guild, then paid anyway, and when they couldn't pay, they came to me, because my stall was the only place left in the safe zone that would feed a person without emptying their pockets. Clove stood at my elbow and read the numbers out loud. "He's gouging because he's scared of you, Ren. A man with a monopoly only squeezes when he feels it slipping." She was right. Doran wasn't feeding the city. He was trying to starve my stall into irrelevance, and the city was watching him do it. So I did the thing Doran could never afford to do, because I wasn't trying to own the city. I was trying to keep it alive. I fed people for whatever they had. A coin, a promise, nothing at all for the ones with hollow cheeks and children on their hips. And every free bowl bought me something gold can't, a city that would remember who fed it when it was starving. It cost me, and the ledger showed it. Ingredients burning down, gold I could have pocketed sliding into the pot instead. Clove winced at every loss and didn't stop me, because she's a merchant, but she's not a monster. "You'll never be rich feeding the poor," she said. I told her I didn't need to be rich. I needed to be the one they came to. And they came. The reputation number on my interface climbed the way a flood climbs a wall, and somewhere behind it, a colder understanding settled in. The more people I fed, the more the guild's gray blocks started to look like what they'd always been, a leash, and the hand holding it. The third wave broke through a section the city thought was solid, and the only 2 people standing in the gap were my people. Sable, one-armed and cold as winter, cut an evolved monster down with a blade she'd finally learned to wield again. Every dish I'd ever cooked into her humming in that swing. And Ember, the F-rank, the cannon fodder, the girl they were going to throw out of the safe zone, she fought like a woman who'd been given a reason, her stacked buffs turning a body too thin for war into a weapon. I'd fed her first, back when she was starving and done for.
Watching her now, I knew that first bowl had been the best thing I ever cooked.
They held the breach until the reinforcements came,
And the whole wall saw it. 2 women the world had thrown away, standing where S ranks had fallen, powered by nothing but real food and each other. The apocalypse had spent 10 years telling everyone that cooking was worthless. It had never met my girls.
After the wall held, a different crowd came to my door.
Not hunters. The discarded. The injured who'd been thrown out of their guilds. The rankless who'd never mattered. The ones the city filed under useless and forgot. They'd heard about the cook who fed people for free, and they came to see if a place like that could be real.
I fed them, and I didn't ask what they could offer, because I already knew. The same thing Ember and Sable had offered me. Loyalty. Hands. A reason to keep going when the world had given up on them. 30 patrons now, and every single one of them was someone the apocalypse had tried to erase. Clove wrote their names in the ledger, and next to each one, a skill, the way she'd done from the start. A blacksmith with one hand, a scout who'd lost an eye, a cook who'd been laughed out of her own guild. The city throws away its broken pieces, she said, smiling faintly, and you keep picking them up. The rider came through the gate at midnight, half dead, a man who'd run 3 days to reach us. He didn't ask for a healer. He asked for whoever was in charge, and when they pointed him toward the wall's captain, he said the words that would end the small, safe life we'd been living. The neighboring safe zone had fallen. Not weakened, fallen. The evolved breed had hit it in a wave no wall could hold, and now the survivors were coming, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, walking toward our gate with nothing but what they could carry. The city went quiet the way a room goes quiet before a storm breaks. I stood in my kitchen with the embers dying and understood what it meant. A tide of refugees was coming to a city that couldn't feed itself, and the guild would sooner let them starve than spend a single gray block, which meant the only kitchen in the safe zone that might be able to feed them all was mine. They came at dawn, a river of the half-dead, and the gate couldn't hold them all. Hundreds, then more. People who'd walked 3 days through monster country with children on their backs and nothing in their hands but a door they'd carried from a house that no longer stood. The neighboring zone didn't just fall, it emptied. I'd seen hunger in the safe zone. I hadn't seen this. Faces stretched over bone, eyes that had stopped hoping days ago. A mother feeding her baby nothing but water and a story. They poured into a city that already had too many mouths and not enough food, and every guard at the gate wore the same look. Nobody here knew what to do with this many of the dying. The guild locked its storehouses within the hour. That's the first thing a monopoly does when the desperate arrive. It hides the food and waits for the price to climb. I watched the refugees settle against the walls like ash, and I knew exactly what was about to happen if nobody cooked for them. By nightfall, the ward was a different city. Strangers sleeping in doorways, fighting over a cup of water, and the old residents eyeing them like a threat. Food was the crisis now, not monsters. A city that could barely feed its own was suddenly responsible for everyone else's, and the cracks were already showing. The guild handed out its gray blocks with a ration cap, and the line turned ugly before it reached the counter. A man with a child got shoved, a woman screamed, and the guards drew blades. I watched it from my stall and felt something in my chest harden. This was what 10 years of Doran's monopoly had built, a city that starved its neighbors in the middle of the apocalypse. Clove came back from the market with the numbers, her face tight. "They'll riot by morning," she said. "An empty belly doesn't care about the law." She was right, and somewhere in that crowd were 200 people who'd walked 3 days to be told there was nothing for them. I looked at my stove, and I made the only choice a chef can make. "I'll feed them." I said it out loud before I'd finished thinking it, and the whole street went quiet. Sable looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Ember looked at me like I just said the sky was safe again. Clove just closed her ledger and said, "Then we'll need more of everything, because that's who she is." I didn't have the ingredients for 200. I had a stall, a team, and 30 patrons who knew how to work. But I'd learned something in 10 years of being worthless. You don't wait until you have enough to start. You start with what's in front of you, and you keep cooking until the pots run dry, and then you find more. So I put the word out through every patron I had. The stall was cooking for the refugees, free at dawn, and anyone who could haul water or chalk a route was welcome.
By midnight, I had 40 volunteers and a line of donated ingredients that stretched past the door, because it turns out a city that's been starving knows exactly what food is worth. I turned the street into a kitchen. Every pot I owned, every fire we could light without burning the ward down, every pair of hands that knew how to peel or chop or stir, all of it in a line, the way my father's restaurant used to run on festival nights, back before the world ended. An assembly line for the apocalypse. Ember ran it like she'd been born to. She'd never led anything before, but hunger had taught her how to move, and she moved people, refugees into the line, volunteers onto the pots. The too tired pushed gently toward the finished bowls. I watched a girl the city called cannon fodder command a kitchen of 40 strangers, and I felt something like pride. Sable kept the peace with one arm and a look that ended arguments. Clove kept the tally, every bowl accounted for, every ingredient stretched to its last bite. And I cooked, not fancy, not for an auction, just food, real food, hot and honest, and enough of it, I hoped, to keep the dying alive one more day. It worked until it didn't. By the second afternoon, the shelves I'd thought were full stood empty, and Clove set the ledger down with the number that had been chasing us all day. 5 ingredients left. 5, with 200 mouths already fed and 100 more waiting, and the nearest supply route picked clean. The refugees kept coming, and every new face meant another bowl I couldn't fill. I'd fed an army and taught it to hope, and now I was watching the bottom of the barrel come up to meet me. This was the bottleneck the system had been warning me about since day one. Ingredients spoil, supplies run out, and demand never stops. Clove was already working it, of course. My old roots are dead, she said, but a root is just people who know people. She started sending runners to every contact she still had, calling in favors she'd been saving for years. I watched her work and understood that feeding a city wasn't a cooking problem anymore. It was a supply chain war. So I rationed the way a starving man learns to. Every bowl a little thinner, every portion stretched with water and roots and whatever the ward could spare. It hurt to do it. A refugee who'd walked 3 days deserves a full bowl, not a promise. But a thin bowl that keeps 50 alive beats a full one that feeds 5 and starves the rest. Clove's network came through in scraps. A cart of wilted greens, a hunter's kill too old to sell, a merchant who owed her a debt and paid it in grain. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But it kept the line moving, and a line that moves is a city that doesn't riot. I learned the ugliest lesson of the whole week. Generosity at scale isn't a virtue, it's a logistics problem. Every free bowl had to come from somewhere, and somewhere meant people risking their necks in monster country to bring me something to cook. The more I fed, the more I owed, and I owed it to people who'd already given everything. Then came the night the line finally cleared, or cleared enough. I stood in the square and watched hundreds of people eat real food for the first time in weeks, some of them for the first time in their lives. Not gray blocks, not scraps, stew, hot and honest, and with every bowl a permanent buff settling into a body the apocalypse had nearly broken. I saw a man who'd been too weak to walk stand up and carry a water barrel for the tent line. A grandmother who'd been carried through the gate feed a child with her own hands. The buffs spread through that crowd like a slow fire, and I understood what I'd actually built. Not a stall, not a kitchen, but an army that ate from the same pot. The system ticked over and over as the bowls went out, counting dishes the way it always did, and I stopped watching the numbers and started watching the faces. That was the real currency. A fed man doesn't riot, a fed man fights, and a city full of fed men might just survive what was coming. By morning, the whole city had decided. The refugees told the residents, and the residents told each other, and the name that came out of every mouth wasn't the guild's, it was mine. The worthless chef had fed the city when the city's own guild locked its doors. There's no marketing like that. There's no loyalty like a full belly in a famine. My reputation number didn't just climb, it exploded. 500 now, and every point was a person who'd eaten from my pot and decided forever whose side they were on. Clove stared at the interface like she was reading the future. 500 people, Ren, she said. That's not a customer base, that's a following. And she was right in the way that scared me. I'd wanted to be a chef once before the world ended. Now I was something else, the man who feeds the city, which in a city this desperate is the same thing as the man who leads it. I hadn't asked for that, but I wasn't going to drop the ladle and let them starve.
Across the city, the guild's ration line stood empty for the first time in 10 years. Nobody wanted gray blocks when there was real food across the ward, and nobody would pay Doran's gouged prices when a free bowl was waiting. The monopoly hadn't been broken yet, but it had been exposed, and an exposed monopoly is already half dead.
Doran watched it all from his window, and I can only imagine what he saw. A decade of control dissolving because one cook had the nerve to feed people for free. You can't compete with free. You can't tax it, can't ration it, can't threaten it, because the moment you do, the whole city sees you for what you are, and they stop being afraid. He'd lost this round without throwing a punch, and men like Doran don't forget that. But there was nothing he could do while the refugees kept coming, and the city kept eating from my hand. The apocalypse had made me necessary. The guild had made itself optional, and everybody in the safe zone could see the difference now.
It was Clove who saw them first, and the color went out of her face like water from a cracked cup. A caravan, clean and well-guarded, rolling up to my stall with the kind of ease that meant money, and walking at its head, a woman with Clove's calculating green eyes and a merchant's coat that had never once been torn.
"That's my mother," Clove said, and her voice was flat in a way I'd never heard it. "The family that framed her for a theft and threw her into the gutter come all the way to my stall? Not for her, I knew, and not for the refugees. They'd come because the worthless chef was suddenly worth something, and merchants always know where the money is." I watched Clove square her shoulders, that ledger tight against her chest like a shield, and I understood what was coming. The city had been saved, and now the vultures had arrived to pick over what was left. They'd want her back, they'd want a cut, and they had no idea who they were about to bargain with. They came dressed like the apocalypse had never touched them. Clean coats, polished boots, guards who'd never gone hungry. The whole caravan parked across my street like they owned it. They walked in like they'd never left, and Clove stood in my doorway like a woman facing a ghost. Her mother's eyes found her the way a ledger finds a mistake. Not warm, not sorry, just a woman pricing her disgraced daughter. Clove had attached herself to the cook who fed a city, and I'd never once seen her afraid. I saw it then, just for a second, before she buried it. Ember moved first, stepping up beside Clove the way she'd stepped in front of me against a mob. Sable hung back, hand on her hilt, reading the guards like a battlefield. And I just waited, because whatever these people wanted, I knew it wasn't Clove. They didn't waste time on apologies. Merchants never do. Her mother laid out terms like a contract already signed. Clove comes home, name restored, place returned, in exchange for a small cut of my operation. They called it a partnership. It was a takeover with better manners. "We're offering you your life back, daughter." And the word daughter landed like a slap. 10 years ago, they'd framed Clove for a theft she never committed and let her rot in the gutter. Now she stood beside the man who fed the city, and suddenly she was family again. The numbers were real. Her family controlled supply routes I couldn't reach, routes that would end my ingredient shortage overnight. That was the knife in the offer, not just taking Clove back, but buying the supply chain, the chef, and 500 patrons at once. Found her on the roof, the ledger open in her lap, her eyes somewhere past the wall. "They're my blood, Ren," she said. "They threw me away, and I swore I'd never want them back. And now they're offering it all, and I can't stop thinking about it." I didn't tell her to stay. That had to be her choice, or it meant nothing. I said only what I knew. The family who framed her hadn't changed, and the offer wasn't love, it was arithmetic. But whatever she chose, the stall would still be here when she made up her mind. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You'd let me go back to the people who ruined me." I shook my head. "I'd let you choose, because nobody ever let you choose anything." That was the moment she saw what this team was, the first people who'd ever wanted her for who she was. The night they framed her came back in pieces. She'd been the family's best accountant, the daughter who caught the discrepancy everyone else missed, the books that showed where the guild's missing inventory had gone. She should have burned that page. Instead, she brought it to her father. They didn't thank her. They took the page, told her to forget it, and 3 nights later the guild's enforcers found a stolen shipment in her quarters, planted, signed for in a hand that looked like hers. Her own family had put the evidence in her room and closed the door. They ruined her because she knew too much. That was the part she'd never told me. The family didn't just frame her for a crime. They buried the proof that they'd been skimming the guild for years, and that proof, if it still existed, was worth more than any caravan.
It clicked for me then, all at once. They didn't want Clove back because they'd remembered they loved her. They wanted the supply chain, the routes she'd rebuilt, the contacts she still owned, access to the one cook in the city the guild couldn't touch. And beneath that, the older fear, the page she'd found, the ledger she'd never given up, proof her family had skimmed the guild for a decade. They didn't know if she still had it. They couldn't ask without admitting it existed. So they dangled family and forgiveness, hoping she'd take the bait.
"They're not offering me anything," Clove said, and her voice had gone cold and certain. "They're offering to buy my silence before you get big enough to matter, and they're doing it by pretending I was ever welcome back." For the first time since the caravan rolled up, the fear was gone from her eyes. Her mother came back that night, without the caravan, alone, and dropped the pretense. Come home, sign over the routes, deliver the cook's supply line, or the family would make sure no ingredient ever reached my stall again, and everyone Clove had helped would learn exactly who she'd robbed. Bribe, then blackmail, the 2 oldest tools in a merchant's kit, and her own mother wielded them without shame. I stood outside the door and watched Clove through the crack, back straight, green eyes flat, fingers white around the ledger she'd carried through the gutter and the apocalypse. They'd underestimated her, the way everyone always had. She wasn't the girl they'd thrown out anymore. She was the woman who'd kept my kitchen alive through an embargo, a poisoning, and a city full of refugees. She'd learned exactly what a family like hers was worth. She walked into the front room and burned it all down in 3 sentences. "I'm not coming home," and her voice didn't shake. "I'm not selling the routes, and if you ever threaten my people again, I'll show this city every page of the ledger that sent me to the gutter." Her mother's face went through something ugly, shock, then rage, then the cold fear of a woman who'd realized the blackmail went both ways, and she'd lost. Clove didn't blink. "You threw me away. These people picked me up. I know exactly where I belong." And that was it. The family left with their caravan and their empty threats. And when Clove turned around, she wasn't crying. She looked lighter, the way a person looks when they finally put down a weight they've carried for a decade. Blood or not, she'd chosen us in front of everyone. That night, she opened what she'd carried for 10 years. Not the ledger she showed the world, but a thin sheaf of pages in its lining. Copies of the real books, shipment dates, amounts, signatures, proof her family had been skimming the guild's inventory for a decade with guild approval. "I never stopped wanting to give these to someone who'd use them," she said, and laid them on the table. They weren't just her family's crimes. They were the guild's, hidden ledgers showing where the monopoly's missing food had gone while the city starved. Doran's name was in there, in his own hand. She'd given me more than her loyalty. She'd handed me the weapon that could end the guild, because the guild's power wasn't muscle or monsters, it was the lie that only they could be trusted with the food. Now I had the receipts. "Make it count, Ren," she said. By morning, Clove's choice started paying for itself. Her family's routes, the ones they'd threatened to cut, belonged to her now. Not because she'd signed anything, but because the people who ran them had known her since before the fall. You can't buy that kind of loyalty. The cart started rolling in by noon. Real ingredients, grain, salt, dried meat, the things I'd rationed to dust. Clove took delivery the way she'd dreamed of running a supply line, and my ingredient count climbed for the first time in weeks. The guild had no idea it had just lost its own chain. "The family controlled the routes because everyone owed them," she said, smiling for the first time in days. "But debts follow the person, not the name. And most of these people owe me. The supply chain had always been hers. It just took choosing us for her to claim it." I spread the ledgers out under the lamp that night, and the 4 of us stood around them like a map of a war we were finally ready to fight. Doran's name, the skimming, the warehouses where the city's food had gone while people ate gray blocks. It was all there, in ink that couldn't be argued with. "This is how he controls everything,"
Clove said. Not the food itself, the secret of where it goes. Break the secret, and the monopoly has nothing left to stand on. She'd waited 10 years to say that, and I could hear all of them in her voice. The girl in the gutter, the woman at my door. I looked at my team, a one-armed sword, a cannon fodder girl, a disgraced merchant, and a worthless chef, and I knew the ledger on the table wasn't just evidence. It was the first move in the last fight. Doran had spent a decade starving this city. Now I had the proof to break him. I spent a year in this city thinking the food guild was a wall I couldn't climb. Then Clove set the truth on my table. Ledgers, routes, names, every coin Doran skimmed while the city ate gray blocks. She just needed someone with the nerve to dig. My reputation had done what no blade could. 500 people owed their lives to my food. Hunters who ate before a surge, mothers whose kids got real soup. When a man feeds the city remembers. I didn't have to convince anyone the guild was rotten. I only had to show them the receipts. So we did it in the open. Clove copied the ledgers, Ember ran them to every corner of the lower ward, and Sable stood behind me like a promise. We weren't asking permission anymore. We were serving the guild an eviction notice, seasoned with 10 years of their own theft. A ledger is a boring thing, but a hungry man reads it like a death sentence. Clove's copies hit the market at dawn, and by noon, the square was full of people holding the proof of 10 years of theft, their ration numbers, their names, their stolen calories in black ink. The guild's own enforcers couldn't stop it. You can't beat a crowd with a badge when the crowd is reading the truth out loud. People who'd bowed to the ration window for a decade straightened up, one by one, and looked at the guild hall the way you look at a thing about to burn. That's the thing about a monopoly. It only works while everyone believes they have no choice. We gave them one. My food, real and cheap, or Doran's gray blocks at 3 times the price. The moment the choice existed, the monopoly was already dead. Doran didn't go quietly. Men like him never do. That night the muscle came, hired blades in the dark and poison in the morning's water barrels, poured while I slept. The same trick as before. A man who controls the food thinks poison is the only language that matters. But I'd learned. Sable smelled the hired knives before they cleared the alley, and one arm or not, she's still S rank. 3 went down before the 4th ran. Ember caught the saboteur at the barrels with poison still dripping from his hands. Clove knew every face he'd taken coin from. The so what hit Doran hard that night. Every dead man's purse had his mark in it, and the poison traced straight back to his guild hall kitchens. He tried to erase me, and all he did was sign his own name in front of a city already holding the pen. We walked into his guild hall at first light, and for once the doors weren't guarded. Doran waited at the top of his cold, polished hall with what was left of his muscle, and he looked at me the way he'd looked at me for a year, like a cook was a rat in the wrong room. He offered me a deal with one hand and reached for a blade with the other. A cut of the guild, a seat at his table, my own ration window. Everything a starving chef was supposed to want. Then Clove dropped the full ledgers on his floor, and the last of his enforcers saw the numbers and walked. He didn't fight me with steel in the end. He fought me with the truth, and the truth lost. You can't feed a city, he said. You'll starve them all. I looked at the man who'd starved them for a decade and almost laughed. Watch me. I've been doing it with burned hands and a dead man's knife. Breaking a monopoly isn't a battle. It's an unlock. Clove knew every warehouse, every code, every hidden store the guild had hoarded while the city went hungry. By evening, we'd thrown open the doors and the rations were moving, given out, weighed, and logged, not sold at Doran's price. It wasn't charity and it wasn't theft. It was the supply chain flowing the way it was always meant to. Every sack of grain Doran marked as spoiled went into pots. Every skimmed coin bought real ingredients at the gate. For the first time in 10 years, the food moved for the city, not against it. That's when the system stopped counting me as just a cook. It counted the food, and the hands it reached, and the truth I'd unlocked, and the numbers started climbing faster than any surge. I didn't conquer the guild. I opened the valve. The city did the rest. Here's the thing nobody teaches a cook. In a monster apocalypse, food isn't a meal, it's a throne. The guild ruled for 10 years on nothing but the power to say who eats. The day I took that power from Doran,
I didn't just win an argument, I inherited a city. And it scared me. A leader has to answer for every empty bowl, every hungry child, every surge that kills a hunter who went out weak. Doran ruled by making people desperate. If I wanted to rule, I'd have to do the one thing he never could, keep them fed, all of them, when it was hard. I looked out at 1,000 faces waiting for me to say something, and I didn't have a speech. I had a ladle. If you're hungry, line up, I said. We eat first, we argue after. They didn't cheer, they just formed a line, and that line didn't end, not for hours. Doran fell the way all tyrants fall, not in a duel, but in the eyes of the people who'd feared him. The ledgers went public, the hired blades confessed, and the city voted with its feet. There was no trial, just a crowd, a gate, and a man who finally understood how small he'd been. I could have killed him. Sable's hand was on her sword, and a part of me wanted it. For the poisoned water, the hired knives, the decade of gray blocks. But the worst thing you can do to a man like Doran isn't kill him, it's make him irrelevant. He stood at the gate in his fine ruined coat and looked at me like I'd stolen his whole world. I had. And the thing is, I didn't feel triumph. I felt the weight of what came next. You don't get to burn the old king and walk away. You have to feed what he left behind. We didn't throw a party, we threw a feast. Every pot I owned, every burner Ember could scavenge, every sack of grain from Doran's hoard, it all went into the square, and the square filled up. The lower ward, the hunters, the merchants, the kids who'd only ever tasted gray, they all ate that night. I cooked until my burned hands shook, and I'd never been happier. Ember hauled and chopped and laughed. Clove weighed every bowl so the feast wouldn't empty the stores, and Sable stood watch on the rooftop, because a celebrating city is a city with its guard down. We fed them all. That's when I understood what a chef really is. Not a man who makes food, a man who makes it matter. 1,000 people ate that night and slept with full bellies for the first time in a decade. And somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped being the worthless chef. At dawn, the system showed me what the night had built. Patrons, 1,000. Not customers, patrons. People who'd thrown their lot in with a cook and 3 broken women. Not because I'd paid or threatened them, but because I'd fed them and asked for nothing back. Every patron is a mouth to feed, and a pair of hands, and a pair of eyes. 1,000 mouths is terrifying if you only think about the cooking, but 1,000 pairs of hands is an army. Hunters to hunt, foragers to forage, cooks to help me stir. The city became my kitchen. I stood on the Guildhall steps and looked at the number and didn't feel big. I felt responsible. 1,000 people had bet their survival on a man with burned hands and a dead father's knife. I'd broken the guild because someone had to. Now I had to be worth it. Sable came back from patrol late, and I knew before she spoke that something was wrong. I'd seen her cold, bored, dangerous, but never like this. Her one hand was white on the hilt of her sword, and her amber eyes were fixed on something 1,000 miles past the wall. She told me quiet, the way she says the things that matter. There'd been a tremor in the deep dungeon, the deep one, the one no hunter's gone into and come back whole, and in it, stirring after 10 years, was the thing that had taken her arm, the boss she'd lost to. She didn't ask me for anything. She just stood there, a broken blade remembering the fight that broke her. And I looked at the city I'd just won, and at the woman who'd helped me win it. The guild was over, but Sable's war was only just beginning. The tremors started the night after the feast, and they didn't stop. The deep dungeon, the first one that ever broke open 10 years ago, was glowing again, and every hunter in the city felt it in their bones. The thing down there wasn't dead. It had been sleeping. Now it was waking up hungry. I'd never seen the deep dungeon, but I knew its name the way every cook knows a fire. It was where the apocalypse started, the first rift, and 10 years ago, an S-rank hunter named Sable went down into it and came back with an empty sleeve and a name the world threw away. The hunters on the wall said it was stirring, not emerging, not yet. But Sable didn't sleep that night. She stood at the parapet, one arm, silver hair in the wind, staring at the glow like it was calling her name. I knew then we weren't waiting for it to come to us. We were going down.
I found her at the stall before sunrise,
Sharpening her sword alone, patient, refusing help. 10 years ago, that sword took a boss's eye before the boss took her arm. She'd never stopped sharpening it. She'd just stopped believing she'd ever be whole enough to use it right.
I didn't tell her it was too dangerous, or that she'd already done enough. She wouldn't have heard me, and she'd have been right to. This wasn't a dungeon run for ingredients. This was the reason she'd spent a decade in the gutter with a ruined name. The world owed her this fight. So I did the only thing a chef can do for a warrior facing her monster. I didn't beg her to stay. I asked her to wait 1 day for me to cook. You're not going down there with one arm, I told her. I'm going to give it back first. And for once, her eyes looked like hope. The system had a recipe for it. Titan marrow stew. The same dish I'd used to start Sable's healing, but a fuller version. Not just strength, full regeneration. Limb, nerve, bone, all of it. Grown back from a dungeon boss's marrow and a dozen herbs not seen on the surface in years. The ingredients were the bottleneck, the way they always are. Clove emptied half our gold to source what the system asked for. A deep boss marrow, marrow thistle that only grows on a rift's lip, firemint, and a root so rare the merchants sent runners into the wild for it. I cooked for 14 hours straight, and my burnt hands had never worked harder. The spoilage clock hung over every herb. Wilt one, and the whole dish fails, and we're out half our gold with nothing to show for it. But a chef doesn't get to miss, not when a woman's arm is on the line. We went down at dusk, all 4 of us, into the place where the apocalypse was born. Ember scouted ahead with the torch. Clove carried the sealed dish and the emergency kit, and Sable led with one arm and a sword she still couldn't fully swing. If the dish spoiled before she ate it, we were all dead. The deep dungeon wasn't like the rifts outside the wall. It was older, colder, and it breathed. The walls glistened with the glow the hunters had seen from the parapet, and the deeper we went, the more the monsters watched us, not attacking, just waiting for the real predator. Then we heard it, a sound like a mountain grinding its teeth, and the floor shook. Sable's hand went to her sword, and she didn't flinch. She looked almost calm. 10 years of dreaming about this thing, and now she was walking toward it with a warm pot of stew and a chef behind her. The boss was everything the stories said. A thing of black carapace and too many limbs. The first monster, the one that opened the door 10 years ago. Sable met it with one arm and a decade of rage. Cold, precise, impossibly strong. One arm against that thing is a death sentence. I got the dish to her between the boss's swings. Ember drew its attention, Clove covered me, and Sable ate the stew standing over a monster that had already killed her once. The regeneration hit her mid-swing, and it wasn't gentle. Her right arm grew back in a scream of light. Then she looked at her own right hand, a hand that hadn't existed that morning, and she smiled. The boss lunged, and she caught its claw with both arms and threw it back. 10 years the world called her broken. It was about to learn how wrong it had been. She killed it the way an S-rank kills. Fast, once she stops holding back. The boss that had taken her arm and her name and a decade of her life went down to a blade she finally held with both hands. And when it hit the ground, the whole dungeon went quiet. I didn't cheer. This wasn't my win. I watched her stand over the thing, both hands on her sword, breathing hard, and I saw 10 years fall off her shoulders all at once. The gutter, the mocking, the empty sleeve, all of it settled into that dead thing's shell, and she was free. She turned to me and didn't say thank you, because that's not how Sable says anything. She just raised her right hand, the one I'd grown back in a pot of stew, and flexed the fingers, and looked at me with those cold amber eyes, warm for the first time, and she was smiling. The so what of giving a woman her arm back hit the city before we got home. A fully restored S-rank isn't just a fighter. She's a deterrent, a legend, a reason every monster and rival faction in 3 safe zones thinks twice. I turned my best protector from broken into terrifying. The word spread faster than any ration rumor. The one-armed blade was whole again, and the chef who'd fed her was the reason. Hunters who'd written Sable off came to see it. Men who'd mocked her suddenly remembered they'd always believed in her. Reputation isn't honest. Power is. That's the price of it too, and I knew it. A chef with a fully restored S-rank at his back,
is no longer a curiosity. He's a power. Every faction that wanted Sable dead or wanted her strength bought would come sniffing now. I'd solved her problem. I'd just handed myself a bigger one.
She asked me to walk the wall that night, the first time she'd ask for anything soft. She told me about the last 10 years, guilds that closed their doors on a one-armed woman, hunters who called her washed up, the nights she almost walked into the wild and let it end. I didn't have a cure for 10 years of that. Nobody does. But I stood there with her, and I fed her, and I let her talk until the words ran out. Some wounds a dish can't close. Those was, you just stay, and let the person know they're not fighting alone anymore. By the time the stars came out, she was quiet, and the quiet wasn't cold the way it used to be. She'd put the past down in that dungeon, next to the thing that broke her, and walked out the other side. The broken blade was a sword again, and she was ours. The team came out of that dungeon different. Ember fought like a real hunter. The cannon fodder F rank was gone, a girl whose permanent buffs made her something the guild never predicted. Clove had learned to hold a line and carry a kit under fire. Sable moved with both hands. I looked at them over a full stall. Sable carving meat with the arm I'd cooked back. Ember hauling pots twice her size. Clove balancing the ledger and a ladle. And I felt something I'd forgotten I could feel. We weren't four broken people patching a leak. We were a crew, a family, a power. The system agreed. Our stores were thinner. The restore dish had cost us gold and ingredients. But our strength was up, our reputation climbing, our patron count past 1,200. We traded coin for power, and power buys everything else back with interest. We went back down one last time to strip the boss's chamber, and that's when we found it. Behind where the beast had slept, carved into the black stone, was a recipe older than the apocalypse, the crown of the kitchen, a legendary dish that doesn't buff a person, but a whole city. And under it, one line that turned my blood cold. The system didn't write it, something older did. The king wakes when the crown is cooked. We'd killed the first monster, but whatever it had been running from was still down there, and the recipe was the key to waking it. I stood in the dark with a legendary recipe in my hands, and a choice I didn't want to make. Cook it and arm a city, and wake the thing that made the apocalypse. Don't cook it, and let whatever's coming catch us empty. Sable touched my shoulder. Whatever it is, we face it fed. The recipe we dragged out of the deep dungeon sat on my table like a bomb with a timer. The crown of the kitchen. A dish that doesn't buff a body, but a whole city at once. Every man, woman, and child in range, permanent and stacking. It was the kind of power that ended wars, or started them. The catch was written underneath, in stone older than the safe zone. The king wakes when the crown is cooked. The first monster had come up from the deep 10 years ago running from something. Whatever it ran from was still down there, asleep, and this recipe was the bell that would wake it. I didn't cook it that night. I made Clove and Ember and Sable sit down and talk it through, the way you plan a menu when the kitchen's on fire. Cook it and we're strong and it wakes. Don't cook it and it wakes anyway. Hungry and we're weak. The math was ugly, but it was simple. We cook. The crown's ingredient list was the real horror. Most of it we had or could trade for, but one ingredient stopped the dish cold. Heart of the deep, grown where the apocalypse first broke, guarded by whatever still lived down there. The rarest ingredient in a 10-year apocalypse. We went into the deep dungeon, past the boss's shattered shell, into the part no map had reached. Ember led, Sable flanked, Clove mapped. I carried the torch and the recipe. The deeper we went, the more the walls glowed, until we found it, black crystal pulsing like a heartbeat. It was beautiful, and it was wrong, and it was exactly what the recipe asked for. But a thing like that doesn't sit unguarded. The moment Ember reached for it, the dungeon shifted. Not a monster this time, but the dungeon itself, closing around us like a throat. We had to get it out alive. So what caught up to us halfway out? Word of the crown had leaked, the way it always does when a dish is too powerful to stay secret, and Doran's remnants were waiting in the tunnel. The guild survivors wanted the ingredient, and they wanted me dead. They'd come for the same reason I had. Whoever cooks the crown owns the next chapter of the world. They wanted to sell it. I wanted to feed a city.
"Hand over the heart," their leader said, "and we'll let the women walk." Sable answered before I could and drew both swords.
A fight in a collapsing dungeon is the worst kind of kitchen.
The walls were moving, the rivals screaming, the heart and cloves pack pulsing hotter every second. We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because we'd done this 100 times, fed and buffed to the teeth.
We came out of the deep dungeon with the heart of the deep in cloves pack and half a dozen guild survivors left in the dark behind us.
The sun felt like a gift. Ember was bleeding from a cut she'd earned, blocking a blade meant for me. But we had it. The rarest ingredient in the apocalypse was ours.
The heart didn't keep quietly. It pulsed in the daylight, and everyone at the gate felt it the way you feel a storm before it breaks. I saw the greed move through the crowd in real time. A thing that valuable draws predators until someone cooks it or dies for it. So we didn't waste a breath.
The clock on a legendary ingredient isn't spoilage, it's theft. I sealed the heart in brine, set Clove to guard the stall, and started the recipe from the top. We had days before the city knew. I planned to be cooking by then.
Cooking the crown was the hardest thing I've ever done,
and I've cooked through a monster surge. 100 steps, and half would ruin the dish, and the city if I blinked. Sable butchered, Ember stoked the fire, Clove checked each measure. 1 pot, 14 hours, no second chances.
The heart of the deep fought me the whole way.
It wouldn't cut clean, wouldn't soften, and twice it nearly spoiled the broth out of spite. A legendary ingredient isn't just rare, it's resistant, the way the apocalypse is. I cooked it down with every skill my burned hands had earned.
At the end, the whole kitchen went still, and the dish glowed the way the dungeon had glowed. The system lit up with one line I'll never forget. "The crown is cooked, the king wakes." I set down my ladle and looked at my team. "Eat up," I said. "We're going to need it." We didn't eat the crown alone. That's not what a dish like that is for.
We carried the pot to the square and served it to everyone. 1 bowl each, hunter and refugee and child and merchant. A single spoonful enough. The effect wasn't a stat. It was a covenant. The city ate and it changed.
The buff rolled out over the safe zone like
Dawn breaking. Not a number on a panel, but a feeling in 1,000 chests. Old hunters stood straighter. Sick kids got color back. The wall guards felt the years fall off their shoulders. The crown wasn't a meal. It was the city standing up.
Stood in the middle of it,
watching 5,000 fed from 1 pot, and I understood the recipe's name. The man who feeds the city doesn't serve it, he crowns it. Then at the square's edge, Ember and Clove re-inked to S rank. 3 S ranks, all owed to a worthless chef.
The so what of feeding a city wasn't just strength,
it was unity. 5,000 patrons didn't go back to their corners after the crown. They picked up tools. Hunters formed squads. Merchants emptied their stores into the common pot. The safe zone became a people.
That's the real math of a chef's power,
the one the guild never understood. Food doesn't just fill a belly, it buys trust, the only currency that survives an apocalypse. I'd fed them starving and asked for nothing. Now 5,000 stood ready to fight for a man with a ladle.
And they brought everything.
Ingredients poured in faster than we'd ever sourced them. Hunters with monster parts, foragers with herbs, Clove's old contacts reopening routes closed for a decade. The bottleneck that had choked me since day one, food and the getting of it, finally broke.
Nobody voted and nobody crowned me.
It just happened the way real leadership does. One day I looked up and I wasn't running a stall anymore. I was running a city. The guild hall where Doran once starved a population became my kitchen. The weight didn't get lighter. I just got stronger carrying it.
I tried to stay a cook.
That's what kept me honest. A leader who forgets the food forgets the people. So I kept my burned hands in the pots, kept the line moving, and let Clove run supply, Sable run defense, Ember run the people. A kitchen isn't one man at the top.
The hunters called me the guild master, and I hated it at first.
The word tasted like Doran. Then I looked at the line of fed people and thought, no, a guildmaster starves. I'm a chef. A chef who feeds a city isn't their ruler. He's their cook. They'll die for their cook before a king.
We didn't get long to enjoy it.
The deep dungeon had been glowing since the crown was cooked, and now it was worse. A light in the ground like a furnace door, visible from the wall at noon. Whatever the recipe had woken was climbing. The apocalypse's source was on its way up.
So I cooked like the world was ending, because it was.
Every pot went to the wall, every buff dish to the hunters who'd hold the line, every spare ingredient into the stores. Ember drilled the civilians, Sable ran the formations, Clove counted every calorie like a bullet.
I'd spent my whole life thinking cooking was worthless,
And now a city was arming itself around my kitchen. Funny how the apocalypse works. It takes everything, then hands it back and asks if you're strong enough to keep it. The answer was out there, climbing, and for once, we were ready.
It came at midnight, just the ground splitting and the sky going black.
The Monster King rose out of the deep dungeon like a mountain standing up. Every person on the wall understood what the apocalypse had been running from. The first monster had fled.
I stood at the gate with a ladle in my hand,
and 5,000 fed people at my back, and I looked up at the thing trying to take it all away. The size of it should have broken me. Instead, it cleared my head. For the first time, the worthless chef wasn't facing the end alone.
The Monster King roared, and the wall shook.
And somewhere behind me, a hunter's voice said what we were all thinking. "Chef, what do we do?" I tightened my grip on the ladle and turned to the 5,000. We eat, then we fight. Nobody faces the end of the world on an empty stomach.
The Monster King didn't attack at first.
It just stood there, a thing the size of a storm, and looked down at the city the way a man looks at a meal. 10 years ago, the first dungeon broke open, and nobody asked what the monsters had been running from. Now it stood in front of us.
I'd cooked the crown,
And the crown had rung the bell. That part was on me. But standing at the gate, watching the source of the apocalypse breathe in the dark, I didn't feel guilt. The thing was always going to wake up. The only question was whether we'd be ready when it did.
and we were. That's easy to forget when you're staring up at a monster the size of a mountain.
5,000 people stood behind that wall, fed and standing, armed and angry. The worthless chef hadn't saved the world yet, but for the first time, the world had a chance.
By morning, the runners were pouring in,
And the news was worse than the monster. The King's Awakening had cracked every rift on the continent, and every safe zone watched the same black shape. One city couldn't fight it alone. The math said we were all dead. The math never met my kitchen.
The other zones sent word, the way desperate people do.
Some begging for hunters we couldn't spare, some barricading their gates and praying, some already burning. It would have been easy to close our gates and wait, but that's not what a cook does when the neighborhood's on fire.
So I made the call no guildmaster would have made.
We opened the gates. Every refugee, every hunter, every last mouth, bring them in. If the apocalypse was coming for the whole world could come eat first. We don't survive this by hiding. We survive it together.
The plan wasn't a battle plan.
It was a menu. I'd learned the only real rule of this apocalypse. You don't beat a monster by being braver than it. You beat it by being stronger, and you get stronger by eating. Feed every single fighter in the city before the king reached the wall.
Clove turned it into numbers,
The way only she can. 60 dishes in the stores, 50 ingredients, 20,000 gold, about 30 hours before the king got close enough to swing. The bottleneck wasn't courage or weapons. It was time, food, and hands. Now I had a city of hands.
We turned the entire safe zone into a kitchen.
Every burner, every pot, every fire pit and scavenged stove in 5,000 homes went on the line. Hunters who'd never chopped an onion learned to dice. Children hauled water. I didn't need them to be chefs. I needed them to be a kitchen.
What happened next, I still can't explain.
Except that it's what people do when they're fed. The whole city cooked. 5,000 people, then 10, as refugees came through the gate and picked up a knife. It ran on fuel the apocalypse couldn't touch. People with something to fight for.
I moved through it like a man possessed,
Tasting pots, fixing seasonings, catching a sauce before it burned, and a child before she spilled a full cauldron. My burned hands did the work of 10, and when they shook, embers steadied them. For once, I wasn't cooking alone. I was cooking with an army.
and I finally understood what the gourmet system had been trying to teach me since the first bowl of stew. The dish matters, but the hands that make it matter more. I'd spent a decade thinking cooking was one man in a kitchen. It never was. It was this, a whole city,
One fire, one meal.
At dawn, we served the army, and the army ate. 10,000 people lined up before the wall, hunter and refugee, merchant and mother, and every one of them took a bowl of real food and the permanent buff that came with it. The system counted buffs the way a general counts soldiers. The buffs spread through the line like a wave. F-rank hunters felt strength they'd never earned. Refugees felt their hands stop shaking. The buffs stacked, and the army got stronger and faster with every bowl. The king was walking into a city that had just eaten its first real meal in years. Somewhere behind me, a grizzled hunter I'd fed on the first day looked at his hands and laughed. "The chef's food ain't soup," he told the kid beside him. "It's a second chance. 10,000 second chances, served hot." The thing coming up the road had no idea what it was about to bite into. The king hit the wall at noon, and the world shook. But it didn't break. The hunters held the line the way nobody had held a line in 10 years, because they were finally stronger than the things they were fighting. Sable led the charge with 2 swords and a decade of rage. I wasn't on the wall. I was where a chef belongs, at the fire, keeping the food moving, feeding the wounded, forcing a bowl into every hand that came back shaking. That's the real weapon in a war like this. Not the buff, but the bowl. A fed soldier goes back up the wall. A hungry one stays down. The king didn't understand what it fought. It had spent 10 years terrorizing a starving world, and starving things break easy. But this city wasn't starving anymore. It was fed and angry, buffs baked into every bone. The apocalypse looked up at its prey, and the prey looked back. Here's the so what of 10 years, the part I'd have laughed at when the system appeared. The Monster King, the thing that broke the world, died because a worthless chef fed 10,000 people, not because I swung a sword. I never did, because I fed the people who did. It went down slow, the way big things do, and when it fell, the whole continent felt it. Every rift, every dungeon, every safe zone that had held its breath for a decade. The thing that made the world end meant the one thing it couldn't starve out, a city with full bellies, a city with a kitchen. I stood in the smoke with a ladle in my hand, and a girl I'd once fed came running to tell me it was over. And I thought about the stall and the gray blocks and the man who told me cooking was a dead trade. It wasn't. It never was. It was the only trade that ever mattered. The king's body lay across the broken field like a fallen mountain, and the dawn came up red over it. We didn't dance on it. We'd lost people on that wall. Good people, fed people, who'd gone up anyway. A win that costs lives isn't a clean win, but it was a win. But even in the quiet, something was wrong. The thing didn't just fall. It changed, the black carapace cracking open. And before the body went still, the system did something it had never done in 10 years. It flickered, like something on the other side of the light had noticed me looking. I didn't tell the others that part. Not yet. There was a city to feed and dead to bury. But I filed it away the way a chef files a bad smell in the pantry. Not proof, not yet. Just the feeling that the thing we'd killed wasn't the thing that made the apocalypse. It was something's guard dog. We rebuilt the way we'd fought, together and on full stomachs. The walls went up stronger, the gates opened wider, and the refugees who'd come to die stayed to live. Everywhere there was hammering, and I kept the fires going, because a city that rebuilds hungry rebuilds slow. The system showed me the tally, and the numbers told the whole story. 10,000 patrons, 10,000 people who'd thrown in with a cook. The dishes were back up, the gold rolling, the reputation beyond anything a mocked chef should have. I'd started with 0 and a dead man's knife. But I didn't stand up there feeling like a king. I stood in the kitchen with my burned hands in a pot and my team around me. Sable at my back, Ember at the fire, Clove at the ledger. The city could call me whatever it liked. I knew what I was. I was the chef, and there was still a meal to make. We went back to the king's body a week later, once the city was fed, and the apocalypse told us it wasn't over. The shell had cracked open like an egg, and inside it, where a heart should have been, was a door, a rift, glowing with the same light my system had always shown me. The system lit up, and for the first time it spoke without counting dishes. Gourmet system, origin unknown. Purpose, to feed the last. The first cook is not the last. The true source still hungers.
I stared at it, and 10 years of cooking clicked into a shape that made my blood cold.
Sable put her hand on her sword, the hand I'd made, and looked at the glowing door, then at me. "Part 2, she said. I picked up my ladle and walked toward the rift. The Monster King was dead, but whatever had made the monsters and made the system was still out there, and it was hungry.